Chapter 633. Of course, I didn't explode. I was just making up a chapter about getting drunk on National Day. I didn't think there would be a day when I would make up a chapter. I am becoming more and more diligent. After Fan Xian finished speaking, the Northern Qi Emperor did not think of the legendary blind Great Master. He did not, because of these words, begin to reflect on the mistakes he had made during these 2 years because of the Qing Kingdom's powerful pressure. He only stared at Fan Xian in shock and unconsciously raised his hand to rub his forehead. The anger in his eyes gradually deepened. In the end, he could not suppress it. In a low voice, he roared, "You dare to hit me!" Fan Xian dared to hit him. Since he dared to kidnap an emperor, he dared to hit him a few times. The little emperor knew this. He just could not accept that Fan Xian would use a blow to hit him on the forehead. This kind of fighting was not a battle to the death. In his eyes, it carried a clear sense of humiliation. Fan Xian paid no attention to his anger. Furrowing his brows, he said, "During these years, you and I have worked well together. I think I have brought a great deal of benefit to Northern Qi. But you constantly want me dead. Is that not too much?" The little emperor was still tormented by pain and humiliation. He stared at Fan Xian in disbelief. It was as if he didn't know where such a strange being had jumped out of this world to not have any respect for a worker like the emperor. Fan Xian saw him gritting his teeth like a little lion and was instead amused. Shrugging his shoulders, he said, "I am just pointing out the big mistake you have made." He suddenly closed his eyes and thought for a moment. In a quiet voice, he said, "Originally, the impression you left on me was that you were a shrewd ruler. However, your actions these past 2 years have been too eager for quick success. The world is so beautiful, yet you are so violent. This is not good, not good." The Northern Qi Emperor knew that the situation was not in his favor. He had fallen into Fan Xian's hands. Additionally, the great grandmaster in the sword hut who had never shown himself was leaning toward him. The officials outside the sword hut would probably not be able to enter the sword hut to save him. He could only forcefully suppress the anger in his heart and coldly say, "Why do I need to explain my actions to you? You don't need to explain to anyone, but you need to explain to me." Fan Xian's eyes narrowed, and a cold light flashed. "I've given you too many benefits. Even if it's an investment, you have to report to me, the shareholder, instead of trying to kill me." The negotiation between the two men returned to the original place. The Northern Qi Emperor was silent for a long time. Slowly, she said, "I must admit that you have helped me a great deal in the past few years, but what? However, you are, after all, the Qing Emperor's illegitimate child." The little emperor smiled self-mockingly and stood up out of habit, placing her hands behind her back. If this was any other time, this movement would definitely be incomparably elegant and full of emperor's aura. However, today he was dizzy from the shock and his ankle was sprained. How could he stand steadily? With a cry, he fell down. Fan Xian reached out and scooped him back onto the bed, looking at him calmly. The little emperor furrowed her brows and said, "You are a person of the Qing Kingdom and the Qing Emperor's illegitimate child. Regardless of whether or not I believe you have the sincerity to carry out the agreement, even Mother and the officials in court cannot place this illusory hope on a powerful official of the Qing Kingdom." He closed his eyes and slowly said, "You are not a person of Qi. You don't know how the ruler and people of Qi have lived these years after Imperial Advisor Ku He's death. The Qing Kingdom is ready for battle and could send out troops to invade at any moment. Although I have planned for a long time, in the end, the time is still short. It is difficult for the national strength to support a continuous war for many years. Under such circumstances, all past friendships and promises are empty. I must place my hope on my people, even Donnie. I cannot place my hope on you." Fan Xian listened quietly. He knew this logic was actually very simple. Never mind the Northern Qi Emperor, even Haidang, Chun Pingping, and his father did not think he would actually help Northern Qi fight against the Qing Kingdom. If he was going to be a traitor, there had to be some benefits. Presently, Fan Xian was a figure in the Qing Kingdom who stood above tens of thousands of people. If he sold out the Qing Kingdom's interests, did he want the Northern Qi Emperor to give him the throne? He smiled self-mockingly, thinking that no one in the world would believe this, much less the ruler and people of Northern Qi. However, he had never thought about selling out the Qing kingdom's interests to satisfy Northern Qi's request to establish a country. He only wanted to do his best to ease the possibility of a bloody battle to the end and rivers of blood. Just as Li Hongsheng had criticized him in the Dingzhou general's manner, this was a childish and absurd idea. Furthermore, from a certain point of view, it was basically impossible. From this, it seemed that it was only natural that Northern Qi wanted to kill Fan Xian, a powerful Qing official, and tie Dongyi to their own chariot. As for the legendary blind Great Master, it was not that the Northern Qi Emperor did not know of this person. However, his whereabouts were too mysterious. Even if he was truly a great grandmaster standing behind Fan Xian, the threat he posed to Northern Qi was not as real as the powerful Qing Emperor and the powerful Qing army. Seeing that Fan Xian had sunk into thought, the Northern Qi Emperor did not disturb him. Instead, he also closed his eyes and began to think about his situation and what might happen next. One was the ruler of the North, and the other was an official of the South. Just like that, they faced each other in the quiet room, each with their own thoughts. They did not know that time flowed by like water. Without them realizing it, the sunset outside the hut was like blood. It shone on the sword pit, making the branches of the ancient broken swords seem to be dyed with the blood of thousands of years. No matter how long they were washed by the sea wind and rain, they could not be washed clean. Fan Xian stood up and walked to the window. He looked at the large pit in silence. He knew what the countless swords in the pit represented. They represented Sigu Jian's world-dominating sword skills and power. They represented the position of the sword hut in the hearts of the people. They represented the deaths of countless swordsmen and the legends that made one's blood boil. For any kind of reputation or status to remain stable, it actually needed a baptism of swords and blood. In this world, Fan Xian did not have any ability to distinguish or judge how to give those who came after a better future. Did it also need a baptism of blood and fire from the south to the north? Even though he had once discussed it with Yan Bingyun and argued with Li Hongsheng, he still did not have the ability to judge whether the separation of the world or the unification of it would be more beneficial. Prolonged pain? Short pain? Thank you. That was a question for historians. It was not a question that creatures born in the present needed to consider. Creatures only needed to consider the present. This was a selfish instinct of living things. Fan Xian was, without question, a selfish person. After he died, even if there was a flood, he only hoped that while he was alive, this world was like the one he liked. There were flowers, trees, grass, insects, birds, people, poems and paintings, wine and gold. No pain, no disaster, and no blood. Now, he deeply saw himself as a Qing person and not the internationalist warrior he had been in the beginning. Sadly, he had grown into a pacifist. He hoped that while he was alive and his children were alive, Spider-Man or Takashi Kato's famous hand gesture could always be raised. The Overwatch Council's nurturing from a young age and many years of jumping between life and death had allowed Fan Xian to grow into a pacifist. This appeared absurd and inconceivable, but it also proved from another angle that when a person was lying on a sickbed waiting for death, the obsession born could affect him for a lifetime or even 2 lifetimes. Only by knowing the terror of death did one know that one should treasure life. I know the reason for your mistake, Fan Xian slowly said without turning his head. The Qing kingdom has put too much pressure on you. Although the emperor has not sent out a large number of soldiers these years, each move he has made is all to prepare for the great battle in the future. The emperor walks an upright path. He has already eliminated the existence of great grandmasters, so he disdains using his great grandmaster's strength to disturb the world. He has enough confidence to conquer all of you in a fair and square manner. Fan Xian suddenly felt that the sunset outside was piercing to the eyes. He closed his eyes and said, "Actually, I understand the emperor very well. The failure of the northern expedition 20 years ago was a setback that was difficult for him to accept. For him, Monsters like great grandmasters should not exist in this world, even if he himself later became a great grandmaster. He has his own mind and strategy. With these, he can conquer everything. He has a disdain for individual martial power from the depths of his heart. However, he had to first clean out the great grandmasters before he could release this disdain to the extreme. Fan Xian smiled self-mockingly. I think that before He died, he saw clearly the obsession of my emperor. That is why he slowly placed chess pieces in Shiliang and my court. He wanted to play a final game of chess with the emperor. However, he forgot that, after all, he is already dead. It is impossible for him to know all the details of what happened after his death. Furthermore, Haitang and you, whom he placed his hopes on, have each made an unforgivable mistake. The little emperor had been silently listening to Fan Xian's analysis. Hearing this, she opened her mouth and asked, "What mistake? You all underestimate my anger." Fan Xian turned around and looked at the little emperor. Enunciating each word, he said, "I dare to guarantee you that the two moves he made before he died were both prepared to land on me. Yet, you tried to kill me twice. Regardless of whether you succeeded or not, if he knew of your actions, he would certainly die in his grave in anger." Land on you? The little emperor's pupils constricted slightly. She thought back to great Uncle He's instructions before his death. Her expression gradually became serious. She still did not understand why she had placed the hope of Northern Qi survival on Fan Xian. Was he not the Qing emperor's illegitimate child? Was Fan Xian really a great saint? No, the last saint in the world had died a long time ago in the 5th year of the Qing calendar. Fan Xian was only a common person. Fan Xian laughed coldly. Of course, Kui's calculations were very good. He had truly grasped my heart. Even in death, he could not guess whether or not I would continue down the path he imagined. The matter referred to in these words was too secretive. The Northern Qi Emperor could not hear it clearly. I will think of a way to control all of this. If I cannot control it, I can easily leave. Fan Xian walked out of the dusk outside the window. He grew closer and closer to the little emperor's body. In a slightly heavy voice, he said, "It would be best if you could listen to me more." "Why should I listen to you?" For some reason, the little emperor suddenly felt a glimmer of coldness. Fan Xian looked at him and said, "Because you have made too many mistakes. Although the Northern Qi court has been managed well by you these few years, and I had thought that another extraordinary Wuzhou had appeared in history, in the end, I have found that women are still too easily angered and soft-hearted. They cannot hold up much." After these words were said, the little emperor's expression changed dramatically, but he immediately returned to his usual appearance. Narrowing his eyes, he said, "Sir Fan Jr.'s words are becoming more and more mysterious. Earlier, you wanted to kill me. If you hadn't considered Sea Lily's life and had the eunuchs trick her out of the room, and had instead used Lang Qiao to directly attack, perhaps I would already be dead." Fan Xian stood in front of him and lifted his chin with a calm expression. The soft-heartedness of women was completely displayed at that moment. "You have disappointed me so much. How could I continue to do business with you?" The little emperor's eyes narrowed further and further until they became 2 crescent moons. It was as if he wanted to use the slits of his eyelids to look at Fan Xian even more. Only then could he calm the boundless fear and struggle in his heart. This was a secret he and the Northern Qi Empress Dowager had stubbornly kept for 20 years. For this secret, countless people had died in the Northern Qi court and paid a great price. Yet at this moment, it had been lightly spoken of by a Qing person. "My goal today is to enter the sword hut to see Sigajian, but I have another goal. I want to have a private conversation with you, Your Majesty." Fan Xian looked at him and said, "I want to tell you that if you still want to be the emperor of Northern Qi, from now on, don't try to secretly attack me. On the contrary, you have to cooperate with me. Do you understand?" The little emperor pulled up the corners of his lips and laughed loudly. "Fan Xian, you want to threaten me? You can kill me with one stroke of the knife and see if I, the descendant of the Zhan family, will frown. Your determination is truly admirable." Fan Xian looked at him with a smile in his eyes. Enunciating each word, he said, "Naturally, I cannot kill her. I just want to know if Shanhu, Lang Tiao, and a group of important Northern Qi officials suddenly discover that the emperor they are loyal to is actually a woman, what kind of reaction would they have? The Northern Qi, Zhan family only has you one woman. Is there still a need for it to exist? The little emperor stared fixedly at Fan Xian. At this moment, he finally understood why Si Lily had said earlier that Fan Xian would not be afraid of him at all. Instead, it was he who should be afraid of him. It was because Fan Xian held his fate, the absolute fate. The little emperor's voice was raspy. He smiled coldly and said, "The immortal poet of generation does indeed speak with an air of stupidity." Chapter 634. Without question, this is the most difficult chapter I've written since the end of the Qing dynasty. I wrote it for a full 5 hours. Tomorrow's chapter is also very difficult. I just hope everyone is satisfied. Pleasure Before the Palace is the name of the 6th volume. Originally, I had planned to put this scene in the 1st volume. Later, I confirmed that it should be put in this volume. Tomorrow's chapter has the words Emperor of the Qin. Her long hair fell gently from her ears to her shoulders. The warmth of this moment made the Northern Qi emperor perplexed. It was as if the darkness in the deepest depths of her heart had dispersed with Fan Xian's action of undoing her hair. It would no longer become a heavy burden pressing down on the tip of her heart and making it difficult for her to breathe. In that moment, she had already given up and accepted her fate. She even faintly liked that her long hair could float down so softly. Across from her was Fan Xian, the Fan Xian she had once loved incomparably and hated incomparably. The Fan Xian who had once fearlessly displayed her gentle and beautiful side when she was intoxicated by him. The little emperor had no time to think. Perhaps she had already thought that if there was someone in this world who knew she was a girl, Fan Xian would be the best choice. She had long revealed everything to him. However, at the time, he had been unconscious and didn't know. The little emperor's faint beauty and sorrow, a rare glimmer of a girl's aura, and the only return of a woman in her life. It was all on Fan Xian's body. She accepted her fate. She even had to force herself to grit her teeth and suppress the helpless joy in her heart. With a tearing sound, the front of the little emperor's robe was torn open by Fan Xian's coffin-breaking hand with unusual regularity, revealing her body that had never been seen before. She was dumbstruck. Her gaze began to scatter. She was shocked speechless by this powerful attack and danger. She could only stare dazedly into Fan Xian's eyes. Her entire body was stiff and difficult to move. Her hands were tightly clenched in anger and trembled endlessly, causing the wooden bed beneath her to creak. The little emperor did not cover her chest. She allowed the light of spring to gradually seep through the white cloth and fill the room. She stared angrily and hatefully at Fan Xian. She found that Fan Xian's gaze was fixed on her chest. His eyes revealed an aura that she hated. Then, she heard Fan Xian's words about her chest developing. An awkward and angry blush rose from the corner of the little emperor's eyes and gradually spread, covering her cheeks, ears, and neck. In the end, even the snow-white skin on her chest above the white cloth began to glow with a faint and alluring red. Dusk gathered outside the window, but it was far less eye-piercing than the bright red of the little emperor's body. Fan Xian narrowed his eyes. His right hand seemed to not listen to his orders as it reached under the little emperor's chin and flicked. After removing the disguise on the little emperor's throat and removing the fake Adam's apple, even though her chest was still covered by the white cloth, the feeling of her entire person softened, gradually developing in the direction of a little girl. Fan Xian carefully studied her brows, her eyes, and gradually moved closer to her. It was as if he was admiring a unique treasure. He remained silent the entire time. He was indeed very surprised. How could a woman hide from the world for 20 years? She had been emperor in Northern Qi for 20 years, but no one had been able to discover a single problem. His eyebrows had been trimmed since he was young, and they gradually grew thicker. There seemed to be some medicine at the corners of his eyes, which made the emotions in his eyes appear more stable. As for his gaze and manner, it was presumably the training the Northern Qi Empress Dowager had given the little emperor, since she was young. Fan Xian was only in the spirit of research. He was shocked by one of the greatest secrets in the world, which was why he moved closer and closer. He didn't notice that although the little emperor stood angrily and rigidly by the bed, the anger in her eyes grew fainter and fainter into hatred and coldness. The Northern Qi Emperor was a woman. Although this was something Fan Xian had guessed 3 years ago, if the two of them were not alone in the quiet room, he would never be able to confirm or use this in his entire life. Putting aside how he was going to use the Northern Qi Empress Dowager and her son's greatest weakness in the future, just confirming this shocking secret was enough to make Fan Xian excited. Right at this moment, a fist that was definitely not as big as an earthenware bowl appeared in front of Fan Xian's eyes. The skin on the fist was smooth and tender. It was even possible to see a faint green vein. This also proved that the fist was very powerful, had accumulated power for a long time, and was very fast. With a muffled slap, 2 streams of fresh blood flowed out of Fan Xian's nostrils. He angrily covered his nose and glared viciously at the little emperor who still had her fist extended. He thought to himself that it wasn't because of this flat-chested woman that his nose was bleeding, so it wasn't too embarrassing. With his 9th level strength, he had actually been hit in the nose by a female emperor who had only learned a few tricks from Lang Tiao. This was actually embarrassing enough. If he had not been too engrossed, too shocked, and had too much desire to explore the little emperor's face, brows, eyes, and chest, he would not have been hit by this punch. The little emperor slowly pulled back her fist and smiled coldly. In my life, I have never been so lightly humiliated by anyone. Anyone who looks down on me will pay the price. These words were said with an imposing aura. Paired with the little emperor's natural monarch face and the faint mockery at the corner of her lips, it was powerful without anger. It appeared to have some power. At this moment, the front of the little emperor's robe was completely torn. The strips of cloth hung weakly from the bright yellow sash. She was as wretched as one could imagine, yet she still made such an appearance. It was truly comical. Fan Xian did not laugh. After wiping away the blood from his nose, he calmly said, "I don't care about this punch, but I don't want it to happen again in the future. Don't forget, you are a woman. You are a woman." These words smashed viciously into the little emperor's heart, smashing her heart into chaos. Her liver and intestines were cut into pieces, and her heart trembled with fear. A wave of sadness, anger, and despair filled her heart. Even a messy black hair floating around her lips felt her emotions. It pressed in her lips and let her bite it viciously. Fan Xian was stunned by this hopeless expression. He was not a soft-hearted person. However, he had never thought that the little Northern Qi Emperor would one day reveal such a pitiful appearance. The Northern Qi court and various major events these years had already proven this female emperor's abilities. Under the powerful pressure of the Qing kingdom's ruler and officials, she was still able to maintain Northern Qi's stability. Just based on this, Fan Xian had to give her high marks for her ability to govern. 20 years of pretending and living as an emperor had, without question, twisted the little emperor's mentality somewhat. However, this kind of distortion was still within a controllable range. On the contrary, because she had to be on guard at all times against the leaking of secrets, she became even more cautious and prudent. She had a steadiness and maturity that others of her age could not have. Even when she was being restrained by Fan Xian, she still did not panic. When Fan Xian mercilessly reminded her that her secret could become known to the world tomorrow, she finally could not bear it anymore. Her hard outer shell shattered into countless pieces like a sea snail after being crushed by a large rock. The little emperor's gaze was very hateful and angry, but there was a strange calm inside. It was a calm like a deathly stillness. After the calmness, a crazed expression gradually appeared. Fan Xian had seen this kind of expression before. In the instant before the eldest princess Li Yunrui died, his heart grew nervous. He slowly lowered his hands, ready to act at any moment. The little emperor's expression was slightly wooden. She opened her lips and allowed her black hair to slide down. In an icy voice, she said, "I am not a person who will be threatened." She thought she could guess what Fan Xian would do after knowing her secret. With such a large secret in his hands, given the Overwatch Council's power, he could easily shake the foundations of the Northern Qi royal family's rule. The entire North would sink into chaos because of this news. You cannot use me. If you expose this matter, I will have no value to you. If you hide this matter, how could I allow you to use me? The little emperor looked at Fan Xian hatefully. Fan Xian was silent for a long time. He then slowly lowered his head and said, I don't ask for much. I just want you to be more obedient. The corners of his lips twitched up in self-mockery. After all, you are a woman. No matter how powerful you are, at certain critical junctures, you will never be able to stand up to us stinky men. It is impossible to rely on you to accomplish great things. The little emperor's eyes narrowed. It looks like you have long thought about what will happen next. But why would I listen to you? After these words were said, determination flashed through the little emperor's eyes. Viciousness surged. She took out a small dagger from somewhere in her sleeve and viciously stabbed it toward her chest. After entering the sword hut, Fan Xian felt safe. He did not take the little emperor seriously, so he did not search the little emperor's body. After all, he knew she was a woman and didn't want to offend her too much. He had no idea that the little emperor still had the last dagger she could use to kill herself. Had this dagger been given to her by the Northern Qi Empress Dowager when she was very young? For some reason, a faint glimmer of sympathy suddenly surged in Fan Xian's heart. He sympathized with the female emperor in front of him. She lived in constant fear that her gender would be discovered and that she could not live like other girls. How could there be any joy in such a life? He swept closer and flicked the tip of his finger, flicking the little emperor's pulse. With a clang, the little dagger fell to the bottom of the bed. A viciousness flashed through the little emperor's eyes. Her left hand silently moved the crossbow in her sleeve. Fan Xian's strange cry rang out in the room. He forcefully twisted his body beside the bed. His body rolled like a gray dragon. In an extremely dangerous situation, he avoided the 3 crossbow bolts. His clothes had already been slightly torn by the 3 poison bolts. Fortunately, he was still wearing the Overwatch Council's uniform underneath. Otherwise, this attack alone would have injured him. Fan Xian gave a muffled grunt and threw the little emperor onto the bed. Pressing down on her shoulders with both hands, he angrily threw a punch, landing squarely on the little emperor's cheek. His anger was because he had just felt some sympathy for this female emperor and had almost been secretly injured by her. Only now did he understand that she was, after all, an emperor, a third kind of creature outside of men and women. When faced with the greatest predicament of her life, she would not hesitate to pay any price, even her own life, to kill him. Blood flowed from the corners of the little emperor's lips, but she did not faint. She lay proudly and resentfully on the bed. Looking at Fan Xian straddling her, she said, "If you have the guts, kill me." Of course, Fan Xian would not kill her. After grasping her secret, as long as he could truly subdue her heart, this ruler of a country would become, after Uncle Wu Zhu, his third magical treasure in this world. How could he subdue a stubborn, intelligent emperor who had been a man for 20 years and acted with a masculine decisiveness? The shortest path through a woman's heart was her body. Fan Xian understood this principle. He rode on the little emperor's body and felt the elasticity unique to a woman under him that could not be faked. He knew how ambiguous this position was and how full of spring. After all, he was not a rapist. Furthermore, he did not think that he would be able to achieve his goal after raping the Northern Qi Emperor. Given his judgment of the little emperor, if he let the little emperor go after this, perhaps she would only take hot water to wash her lower body and treat it as if she had been bitten by a dog. She would never see his face again and cut off all of his follow-up methods. The little emperor struggled under Fan Xian's body. Having been raised as a boy, her strength was far more powerful than her martial cultivation. Fan Xian was momentarily distracted and almost flipped over by her. Fan Xian looked at the blood at the corners of her lips and her resentful gaze. A wave of annoyance and anger welled up in his heart. Lowering his voice, He roared angrily. You are such a troublemaker. You want to kill me. That's why I'm dealing with you. Dealing with me? The little emperor suddenly stopped struggling. A fist smashed toward Fan Xian's beautiful and loathsome face. She said angrily, Do you still dare to rape me? Fan Xian dodged this sinister punch and finally found it difficult to suppress his anger. Feeling wronged, he said angrily, It was you who raped me back then. How dare you say I was going to rape you? The little emperor's expression changed. Perhaps she was thinking of the scene that happened in the rundown temple outside Shangjing that summer. Her entire strength weakened. What kind of person was she to treat the emperor as a skilled worker? She knew that she could not lower her head to Fan Xian at this moment. Otherwise, she would be oppressed by him for the rest of her life. Thus, she angrily lowered her head and slammed it toward Fan Xian's chin, intending to turn over and become the master. After the little emperor heard the words that summer, it was as if she had gone crazy. She attacked Fan Xian in a frenzy, biting, twisting, and hammering. No one knew where such a crazy aura and boundless power came from in this little body. Fan Xian did not want to kill her. For a moment, he was beaten into a wretched state. A few red marks appeared on his arm from her bite through his clothes. He was also bitten into a rage. He slapped toward her body with one palm, as if he was hitting Fan Xian's butt. Perhaps the spectators watching the farce in the sword hut would ask, why didn't Sir Fan Jr. knock the little emperor unconscious? The reason was simple. Unconscious people always wanted to wake up. If he didn't make the little emperor yield, Fan Xian would have taken all these risks for nothing. There was another reason he could not say it aloud. In reality, fighting with a female emperor was like fighting with children. Their ears rubbed against each other, their clothes tangled, and their limbs intertwined. It felt like the water in West Lake rippling and gradually flowing into the boat, the bed, and the hearts of the people on it. The two of them carried out a close contest on the bed. It was what was known as judo. Those who had seen judo knew that one of the necessary moves was to pull it close. However, even the sturdiest clothes would one day be pulled apart. In the end, the little emperor's white cloth made of an unknown material finally broke. It made the second tearing sound in the darkroom. Fan Xian was sitting on her body. His eyes were filled with a boundless expanse of snow. His gaze was unfocused. He thought to himself that she was not only a woman, but also a great woman. There were red plum blossoms on the snow. The man and woman playing in the snow were both tired. The little emperor sat on Fan Xian's body with disheveled clothing and pressed down on his hands. She completely did not notice that half of her chest was exposed. It was all in Fan Xian's eyes. The current situation was more like the little emperor raping Fan Xian. The long black hair at the corner of the little emperor's forehead was wet with sweat and stuck together. Paired with her straight brows, it gave her a particularly elegant feeling. Everyone in the world respected her as an emperor and never dared to look directly at her. Even if they did, it was impossible to see any other feeling. However, in Fan Xian's heart, she was a proper woman. Looking at this scene, he felt a sense of excitement he had never felt before. A woman with weakness in her strength, a woman with the identity of an emperor, a woman who would never be satisfied with being ridden on by someone else, clung tightly to him and carried out the most intimate contact. The little emperor rode on Fan Xian's body and didn't feel that Fan Xian had suddenly sunk into silence. She was almost out of strength. She didn't know what her future or Northern Qi's future was. Hopelessness filled her heart. The events of 20 years had made her incomparably tired. She wanted to lie down, but her identity as the Northern Qi Emperor made it impossible for her to lie down and rest. She suddenly felt that she was very pitiful and blinked her eyes helplessly. Following this blink, a few drops of sweat slid down her long black hair and landed on Fan Xian's chin. Like a drop of oil entering a fire, it lit the fire in Fan Xian's heart. Is this the position in the temple? Fan Xian's voice was raspy as he looked at the face and the slightly moving snowy mound close to him. The little emperor held his hands and lowered her head weakly. Boundless sorrow, dissatisfaction, and anger rose in her heart. She suddenly raised her head and stared fiercely into Fan Xian's eyes. Perhaps she was thinking of the scene in the temple, or had made up her mind to decide something in the middle of her life as an emperor, even if it was a crazy and absurd thing. Chapter 635. Good. I finally wrote 6,666 words yesterday. What's funny is that I couldn't do it the day before yesterday when I tried to do it. Yesterday, I wrote carelessly and wrote this many words. The title of today's chapter is Every Emperor, Every Minister. Of course, it's the Chow of day and night, not the Chow of dynasty. I said yesterday that today's chapter was difficult to write. After I finished it and looked back, I found that it was indeed difficult to write. A paragraph of 4,000 words took up 40,000 words of my energy. In this life, I have never written such words. To be able to write at this level, I admire myself very much. It is not only related to eroticism, but also the revealing of my hidden personality. I didn't change Lu Lang to Fan Lang because it was a homophonic sound and it was fun to play around with it. As soon as their lips touched, the heavenly thunder and earthly fire moved, and the wind and rain raged. The two of them were like young beasts on the grassland as they bit each other. There was not much gentleness and charm, only a hint of excitement mixed with hatred. The blood between their lips rippled on the tips of their tongues. It was salty, wet and salty. This was not intimacy or seduction. It was purely a battle between a man and a woman. The use of lips and tongues in battle often walked the path of Su Qin or Zhang Yi. No one had thought that even a kiss could be kissed to the point of blood. A tongue that was like an orchid could also be so stubborn, bouncing, struggling, and forcefully suppressed. In a small space, it transformed into endless symbolic meaning. Either the east wind overpowered the west wind, or the west wind overpowered the east wind. The soft fragrance between the lips and teeth viciously and erotically displayed the process of battle. It made one's tongue ache and salivate, giving birth to the gradually accumulating desire of spring. Li Ao had said that when a man saw a woman, other than one place that was hard, the rest of the place would go soft. Although Fan Xian was a person with a firm will, under such erotic attacks, he was naturally ridden by the little emperor. He was unwilling and tried to resist. Both of his hands hit the other's buttocks forcefully. The tender place that was usually hidden under the dragon robe made people want to ask him, was he hitting someone or was he flirting with them? The twilight outside the quiet room was getting darker and darker, but the temperature inside was getting higher and higher. The air seemed to be filled with the dual aura of battle and intimacy. The aura was mixed together with the faint smell of sweat. From time to time, muffled groans could be heard, making one's heart sway. Someone bit someone's tongue, causing a cry of pain. Someone crushed someone's moon, causing a soft hum. Someone scattered someone's long hair, causing it to scatter on their snow-white skin. Someone hugged someone's waist, causing angry curses and even more intense rubbing to occur. A cut appeared at the corner of Fan Xian's lips. He gazed at the little emperor on top of him, at her fragrant shoulders and jade chest, as well as the stubborn and unyielding gaze in her eyes. With a muffled grunt, he flipped over and pushed her down onto the bed. Pressing down on top of her, he stared fiercely at her. The little emperor did not show any weakness. She stared back viciously and bit down on Fan Xian's shoulder again. She threw out a punch. Her waist exerted strength, wanted to spring up and take back control of the initiative. Fan Xian's expression finally changed. The large wooden bed in the sword hut creaked. He pressed down heavily on the little emperor's shoulders and gazed at her, panting endlessly. He didn't say anything. He only looked into her eyes, wanting to see something more real in them and not something as inexplicable as it was now. Unfortunately, he saw many things in the little emperor's eyes, such as hatred, hidden bitterness, hopelessness, relief, strong desire, and a faint sense of confusion. However, he did not see a glimmer of calculation or anything else. The battle between men and women was often like this. When one discovered that the other had already sunk in first, they would often follow and jump in. feeling the endlessly struggling and tender body beneath him, the rising and falling curves, the two lumps of softness against his chest, the slightly cool skin covered in beads of sweat, and particularly the shape and bounciness he could feel with his body pressed tightly against each other. The calmness in Fan Xian's eyes turned into a wisp of smoke after a moment. Following the little emperor's laborious and quiet hum by his ear, he flew up into the sky and could no longer control anything. His hand slid down from her shoulder and gently held it. Her upper body rose. Her lips slid down from his ear to his shoulder and bit down viciously. He was in pain, so he used more force, causing the thing in his hand to change shape. She was in pain, uncomfortable, and strange, so she trembled. Unconsciously, she hugged his body and straightened her upper body with difficulty. Pressing against him, she felt his heartbeat and her own disappointing heartbeat, as well as that strange and complicated feeling of stimulation. In the quiet room, there were no other sounds. There were only heartbeats, panting, clothes rubbing against each other, and the occasional gust of wind from a fist and two cries of pain. The movements grew louder and louder. The wooden bed was almost unable to endure such torture. The creaking grew clearer, as if it was going to fall apart at any moment. It was confused as to what the man and woman above were doing. If they wanted to do it, then do it well. Life was only a short 70 years. Why fight for this moment? However, what the man and woman were fighting for was this moment. They hurt each other, loved each other, and played with each other. They distanced themselves and then pulled closer. Feeling the other's burning body temperature, they suddenly left with palpitations, but they were also reluctant. Sweat dripped onto the thin blanket and floated faintly on the two of them. It seemed to have been evaporated by the extremely hot atmosphere in the room and turned into a thin mist, concealing the man and woman who were entangled together inside. The silent battle had reached its most critical moment. The clothes were like snow and had long melted in this scene of 3 springs. The two people who had returned to the primitive era panted and looked at each other in a daze. They stuck together. In the end, the little emperor still flipped over and became the master. She sat on Fan Xian's abdomen, her hands pressed against Fan Xian's well-proportioned and hard chest. Her black hair fell down and half covered the snowy mound in front of her chest. Her breathing was uneven. "I want to be on top." There was a patch of mud between the two of them. Sweat followed the black hair and dripped onto Fan Xian's chest and the little emperor's hands. Fan Xian looked at the woman on top of him and felt the strange movement below. His heart beat violently, but he forcefully maintained his state of mind. In a raspy voice, he asked, "I want to know your name." The little emperor was not a normal woman. She was used to being a man and not a delicate woman. Even at such a time full of spring, she still wanted to be on top. As an emperor, she could only ever ride others and not be ridden. She had to be on top. Fan Xian did not care about this. He was a modern person. He knew action and reaction. He knew what the theory of relativity was. Being ridden and riding were all the same. He only had to know the other person's name before that moment happened. In order to become one with him, it had to be a woman with a name, his woman, and not just a female emperor. Emperor was just a title, but a name represented much more. The Northern Qi Emperor's upper body was naked. The clothes on her lower body were piled up. They barely covered her waist and buttocks, but they could not hide the heat and mud inside. There was no longer the despair and resentment from before her eyes. There was only competitiveness and a powerful curiosity toward unfamiliar things, as well as the habitual order of an emperor. The secret room was silent. No one knew how long the two of them had tormented each other, hurt each other, or been intimate. This was the first time they had spoken. After these 2 sentences, the atmosphere in the room seemed to have changed subtly, particularly after hearing Fan Xian ask for her name. The little emperor allowed her black waterfall-like hair to sweep across his handsome face. Stretching out her fingertips, she slid them confusedly across his picturesque brows and eyes. In a raspy voice, she said, "You can call me Daodu right now." "Jean Daodu?" Fan Xian only had time to ask in his heart before he sucked in a cold breath. She gently swayed her waist and buttocks and slowly sat down on his abdomen. As she sat down, the tips of her brows furrowed together as if she was in great pain. The mountain path was narrow. Although it was covered in mud, it made the journey even more difficult. If one wanted to cross the Yellow River, one had to climb the snow-covered mountains of Taiyang. Fan Xian's chest rose and fell. His hands unconsciously slid down her alluring waist and gently placed them on the two lumps of softness in the depths of her clothes. He gently pinched them, idle, fishing in the green stream, suddenly riding a boat to dream of the sun. The path is difficult, and the paths are many. Where's peace now? She gently bit her lower lip, feeling a slight pain. However, she refused to let go for a moment of the hands pressing down on Fan Xian's shoulders. She moved her body slowly, forcefully, and even somewhat domineeringly. The burning pain made her expression appear particularly serious. She was like a ruler conquering all the difficulties and obstacles in the world. Seeing this scene, Fan Xian's expression changed. He was even slightly confused. His hands unconsciously began to move. After an indeterminable amount of time, the ice and snow gradually melted. The wind broke through the waves and gradually reached the vast ocean. The two of them slowly came together and held each other tightly. They trembled because of the pain, trembled because of intoxication, and trembled because of the shyness that had finally floated to the top of the woman's heart. Time gradually passed, and dusk gradually disappeared. The man and woman on the bed were either on top or below. Although they were silent and stubborn, alluring and twisted, no one was willing to admit defeat. No one was willing to lower their heads. A new emperor brought a new group of officials. On the large bed, the relationship between the ruler and his officials had long fallen into chaos. The fragrant path was once swept by a drunken guest. The door was open for you for the second time. The peach blossoms were all gone, and where did they go? When this battle finally ended, it was Fan Xian who successfully returned to the top. He didn't know how many times he had fought with this stubborn woman. Finally, he successfully took advantage of the moment when her entire body was limp to take back control. This battle was crazy and rough. Fan Xian lay on top of her, panting. Out of the corner of his eye, he looked at the wound on his shoulder. He found that the woman beneath him had bitten him until his flesh was a bloody mess. He couldn't help a wave of fear. Lowering his head to look, he saw that the beautiful person in his arms no longer had the usual lofty appearance of an emperor. Her cheeks were rosy, and her gaze was blurry. Her thin lips were slightly open, and her breath smelled like orchids. She was very tired. How was she different from a normal woman? The only thing that was a bit blinding was the green mark on her snow-white chest. Fan Xian's heart thumped. He wondered how he could have been so rough earlier. After a man had his desires fulfilled and exploded, he would change from an animal to a hypocritical saint. He would be willing to light a cigarette and read a newspaper, but he would certainly immediately break away from the woman in his arms. Fan Xian was no exception. He gently held the little emperor's naked body and did not leave. Instead, he watched her quietly, thinking about something. This scene had actually happened 4 years ago. However, at that time, Fan Xian was completely unconscious and didn't know what had happened. What he felt now was very real. It involuntarily gave rise to an absurd feeling in his heart. This long-haired woman was the emperor of Northern Qi, the ruler of a country. Yet, at this moment, she was curled up in his arms like a little rabbit. The little emperor was tired. Her eyes were closed. Her not long eyelashes blinked slightly. She probably hadn't fallen asleep, but she held Fan Xian's waist and refused to let go. The corners of her lips twitched slightly as she sighed in satisfaction. Looking at this scene, Fan Xian should be proud. For some reason, he suddenly felt a chill. He remembered a movie he had seen in his last life. It was the movie that everyone loved, When Sally Met Harry. In the end, Megan cried and had a runny nose as she slept with Billy Crystal, her best friend of more than 10 years. In the end, she pouted her lips and sighed in satisfaction. She was like a pregnant female praying mantis, preparing to enjoy the feast of the male praying mantis later. The story of Fan Xian and the little emperor going to bed today was actually just as strange and expected. She had also cried in a moment earlier. Thus, Fan Xian felt afraid. He was afraid that he would become a male praying mantis. It was at this moment that the little emperor opened her eyes and woke up. She did not pick up the thin blanket to cover her naked body. She brazenly exposed herself in front of Fan Xian. It was as if this was still her country and Fan Xian was her official. She was silent for a moment. Suddenly, she glanced at Fan Xian with complicated emotions. Smiling slightly, she said, "I am your woman." Fan Xian didn't know what he should say right now. Hearing these words, he still felt incomparably awkward. "I want to be on top. I am your woman. I. It was truly a headache-inducing word. The little emperor sat up and very naturally combed her hair in front of Fan Xian. Her eyes looked at the night outside the window. Enunciating each word, she said, "I can promise you that in this life, there will not be another man. Of course, I will not ask you not to find other women. However, you should understand that since I have become your woman, my country is also your country. You have to be careful." Chapter 636. I won't ever write such words again. It's too tiring. Of course, if I only wanted it to be romantic and smooth, I should be able to write it better. The problem is that I can't write it like that. I mainly want to control the whole process and not say a word that shouldn't be said. It's too difficult, but I tried my best. I think everyone can see that. As for those who really had the same interest in details, you can just look at Jiang Shan and The Secret. Those are the true experts, not too much, not too little. It was just a drop of tear. Fan Xian looked at this scene and couldn't help but shake his head, but he couldn't say anything. He felt around for a moment and found a silk handkerchief from his clothes. He put it next to the little emperor's face. He gently dipped it in the water. The little emperor was startled and immediately recovered her calm with a shocking speed. Her bare arms easily slid in her plain white clothing. Her black hair fell to her shoulders, and her expression was calm. There was no longer any charm. Paired with her indifferent eyes, she gave off a sense of antiquity that was unique to Shanjing. She gazed at Fan Xian calmly until his hair stood on end. Only then did she slowly say, "Help me comb my hair." After saying this, she turned her body. Her smooth neck, thin back, and jet black hair faced Fan Xian's eyes. She took out a Tangshan wood comb from somewhere and placed it in Fan Xian's hands. In this world, as long as a woman was married, there would always be a very complicated hair combing ceremony on the morning of the second day. Wealthy families would naturally have a nanny or a high-status servant to take care of it. If it was a poor family, then the mother-in-law would personally comb the daughter-in-law's hair. The Northern Qi Emperor probably had no chance of marrying. As a woman, it had to be said to be a kind of tragedy. In such a deep night, she wanted Fan Xian to comb her hair for her. Fan Xian accepted the comb and slowly began to move his arm, allowing the well-spaced wooden teeth to slide through the jet black hair. The little emperor's black hair gradually smoothed out. Fan Xian's heart and hers also gradually became clear. Fan Xian knew how to embroider and comb hair. He was a good man in the boudoir. In a moment, he had combed the little emperor's hair into a style that was clearly different from that of a virgin. It was also not the style of a mature woman. Borrowing the faint moonlight shining through the window, the little emperor looked at herself in the mirror for a while. She seemed to be very satisfied with Fan Xian's handiwork. During the process of combing their hair, the two of them did not say a word, each deep in thought. It seemed that for a time, neither of them knew how to deal with the situation between them. A moment later, Fan Xian broke the silence and asked, "Why me?" This question was not about today, not about state affairs, not about the last sentence the little emperor said in a drunken manner. It was only pointing to that summer several years ago, to that small temple in that summer. In this generation of the Northern Qi royal Zhan family, other than a few princesses, there was only this cross-dressing little emperor. If they wanted to continue the bloodline of the Northern Qi royal family for a long time, the little emperor needed a child of her own. Even if she had to take a great risk, she still wanted to give birth to a child of her own. That was why, on that summer night a few years ago, Haitang Duo had stopped at nothing to enchant Fan Xian in that temple. Fan Xian only wanted to confirm one thing. Why did Zhang Daodu, the little emperor, choose him to become the target of the seed? Perhaps in some people's eyes, becoming a stud horse was humiliating, but Fan Xian did not feel this way. His mother in this life seemed to have done something similar many years ago. Furthermore, to become a stud horse, it meant that the horse's bloodline was excellent and powerful. Was this another form of recognition? The little emperor sat silently in front of him and didn't reply for a long time. Suddenly, she said, "Your hair is a mess. I'll comb it for you." Fan Xian did not refuse. He handed over the comb and sat quietly by the bed. The little emperor half knelt on the bed and used her knees to crawl behind Fan Xian with great difficulty. She began to comb his hair. The little emperor's posture was very obedient. Kneeling behind Fan Xian and leaning slightly against him, she truly looked like a little wife. However, her hands were not very nimble. As someone who had been an emperor from birth, she was indeed worthy of the evaluation of not working in all four limbs. She had never done anything, much less something as technical as combing hair. The wooden comb slid through Fan Xian's long black hair with great difficulty. Occasionally, it tangled together, making Fan Xian furrow his brows slightly. He didn't make a sound to remind her. He only remained silent. He combed the little emperor's hair to sort out her slightly chaotic heart after their first love and to comfort her extravagant hopes of marrying someone. The little emperor combed his hair because she wanted to appear more like a normal wife. The little emperor knelt behind him and combed her hair earnestly and incompetently. Her gaze lowered slightly and landed on the edge of the bed beside Fan Xian's hand. There were a few thin needles arranged closely there. They glowed with a different light. Some were poisonous, some were not. When they had been intimate earlier, she had already noticed that Fan Xian had carefully removed these items from his hair. She couldn't see Fan Xian's face and could only look at his back. The little emperor's expression relaxed greatly. It made her feel at ease to be able to not let Fan Xian see her expression. In that instant, a faint affection and infatuation surged into the little emperor's eyes. Although it immediately became calm, it still revealed the true affection she had for this young man in the depths of her heart. This was also what Fan Xian didn't understand. Why had he been chosen? Did the little emperor really like him? Your bloodline is very good. The little emperor lowered her head slightly. Her bangs gently swayed in front of her forehead. Since I am going to have a child, of course, I hope to find a good father for the child. What's so good about my bloodline? Fan Xian felt the comb stop on his head. Slowly, he said, "The blood of the Qing royal family flows in my body. Are you willing to let such a child become the future ruler of Northern Qi?" The little emperor started slightly and began to move the comb again with some difficulty. In a quiet voice, she said, "At that time, Duo, Lily, and I did not know you were the Qing Emperor's illegitimate child. Then, what exactly do you see in me?" Fan Xian smiled bitterly and slowly lowered his head. Using the bright and cunning moonlight, he looked at the little emperor's smooth leg beside his waist stretching out from under the white clothing. His back was very warm and soft. It felt good. The little emperor sighed. As she combed her hair, she said, "This matter can't be hidden from you. If I said I saw the tea on my bloodline, it wouldn't make sense." "Of course, it wouldn't make sense," Fan Xian replied calmly. "At that time, no one knew my mother's surname was Yi." The little emperor was silent for a long time. Suddenly she said, "You haven't written Story of the Stone in many years." "Yes." Fan Xian was absent-minded. He seemed to think of the 2 years when their relationship was very harmonious. Every time he wrote a chapter in Jingdo, he would use the Overwatch Council's fast horses to send it to Northern Qi's Shangjing and into the little emperor's hands. The first people in this world to recognize that he had written the Story of the Stone was Haidang Duo and this little emperor. The call of Grandmaster Chao in the palace at night had given Fan Xian a great fright. At that time, he had always thought that this little emperor was just a bit frightening. He had not imagined that the body under the dragon robe was an enchanting woman. "I once told you that I liked Banxian's high poetry," the little emperor said calmly with a slight twitch of her lips. Fan Xian made another sound of acknowledgement. Also, you don't look bad. Your personality can be considered straightforward. You don't look like a typical corrupt scholar. The little emperor lightly said a few words that made Fan Xian sink into silence. He knew that she was using these 3 sentences to express a certain meaning. After a long time, he said, "You like me." The little emperor thought for a long time and then nodded her head. She didn't care if the back of Fan Xian's head could see this action. Fan Xian suddenly smiled bitterly and said, "Should I feel honored? I'll allow you to be proud for a moment." The little emperor's face darkened. Looking at her appearance, it seemed she wanted to bite him again. "I remember the words you said in the royal palace clearly. First worry about the worries of the world, then rejoice in its happiness. I just don't believe whether the world you speak of is truly the world or just the world of the Qing kingdom." The little emperor was silent for a moment and then spoke quietly. It was as if she wanted to give Fan Xian an explanation as to why she was willing to pay any price to defeat Fan Xian. Fan Xian accepted this explanation because he had thought about it for a long time. It was impossible for him to win the trust of the Northern Qi court. No one would believe that the illegitimate child of the Qing emperor was truly an internationalist, particularly someone as intelligent and powerful as the little emperor. He suddenly turned and looked calmly at her close at hand. The two of them were very close. They could feel each other's heartbeat and the heat of each other's breath. He looked at the youth between her brows and suddenly had a thought. He remembered that she was actually just a little girl. "You're an idiot." Fan Xian's words were very direct. "Since you were prepared to invest in me many years ago, then you have to continue. I said this in the afternoon. If Kui knew what you're doing now, he would certainly die of anger again." The little emperor's expression changed. It became solemn and slightly angry. Fan Xian didn't care about any of this. Coldly, he said, "You are my woman. From now on, give up your unrealistic fantasies. Don't try to control me. Don't try to use the method of killing me to disrupt the arrangements of everything in the world. In the future, all you need to do is cooperate with me." The little emperor's eyes lit up. It was not joy but anger. From birth until now, she had never met anyone who dared to speak to her in such a tone. Furthermore, it was said so naturally. "You are an extraordinary woman, but in the end, you are still a woman." For some reason, Fan Xian suddenly thought of the eldest princess who had died in Taiping Courtyard. His voice became slightly warmer. "You and the Empress Dowager have put on a show for so many years and successfully tricked the eldest princess, me, and even the emperor into thinking that there were problems within the Northern Qi court. It made me think that the words by the ancient path in the pavilion had any great meaning." He smiled self-mockingly and said, "I put in too much effort for this, so I will not allow you to destroy all of this. I am not someone to be threatened." The little emperor's expression became cold. She thought that Fan Xian was going to return to the original topic. "I would never threaten my own woman." Fan Xian suddenly stretched out his hand and gently played with the bangs on her forehead. Gently, he said, "However, my woman must listen to me." Earlier, when the little emperor had woken up from her drunken stupor, her first words had pierced straight into Fan Xian's heart. "My country is your country." If it was a normal person in Fan Xian's position, they would probably have a terrible headache. However, he was not the same. From a long time ago, he knew that his actions were far from the ideals of the people in this world. He was mentally prepared for this. Since it was his country, it had to be controlled by him. Even the Northern Qi Emperor had to submit to his will. Conquering the ruler of a country seemed to be something that could never be done. However, conquering a woman, and a woman who liked him at that, no matter how determined her will was or how powerful she was, he could still find a sliver of a chance. A new ruler brought a new court of officials. This was a process of conquering and being conquered. Fan Xian only hoped that since they had this brief relationship, she could become more feminine. However, the development of the situation seemed to have broken away from Fan Xian's control. The little emperor looked at him calmly. There was not a trace of tiredness or dependence after venting. There was only eagerness and dissatisfaction. Fan Xian looked at her eyes nervously. He didn't know what she would do next. "You are my man. Why can't you listen to me?" The little emperor looked at Fan Xian calmly, with a slight smile in her eyes. Without waiting for Fan Xian to speak, she gently bit her lower lip and moved closer to his ear. How about we fight again and listen to whoever wins? The two of them were hugging each other without a gap between them. Suddenly hearing these words, Fan Xian's heart jumped. He thought to himself, who's afraid of a fight between witches? This was the little emperor's first taste of a man and a woman. Additionally, she had a strong personality and was not afraid of pain. She was only curious and happy. Fan Xian, on the other hand, was attracted by her identity, as well as the stubbornness hidden in her bones. They both felt this kind of challenge was very exciting. It was like the meeting of dry wood and raging fire. They both thirsted for each other's bodies. It was truly shameless to use a matter of national importance as an excuse to mess around. A rare charm flashed through the little emperor's eyes. Fan Xian's hand tightened and they fought again. In the sword hut near the seaside, the sky brightened very early. It was still early in the night, but faint morning light spilled into the grass hut. Under the large bed, the two people slowly woke up. They were so tired that they could barely open their eyes. The little emperor was exhausted but happy. She curled up in Fan Xian's arms to catch up on sleep. Last night's madness had perfectly made up for Jean Daodu's many years of spiritual regret. It made her finally realize that being a woman seemed to be a happy thing. However, it had also drained all of the energy in her body. It was clear that Fan Xian, who had obtained the final victory, was even more tired. He opened his eyes and looked at the eaves above his head. An absurd feeling suddenly rose in his heart. Such a thing as conquering had, in the end, fallen to the matter of a brother in bed. Yin Bingyun's mocking words that year had now become reality. If Sir Yin Jr. saw this scene and knew the details, he would probably jump down from the Overwatch Council in shock. Was this the legendary swinging a stick around the world? Fan Xian thought self-mockingly. He lowered his head to look at the woman in his arms with slightly red cheeks. Last night had been crazy. In the end, this female emperor's outer shell of concealment had been shattered by him, and she had become a true woman. As for Fan Xian's hard work, it was not worth talking about to others. A strange light suddenly flashed through his eyes. Lifting the covers, he randomly threw on a robe and walked to the door. The little emperor woke up. She was confused and shocked. She didn't know what had happened. The sound of footsteps came to the door. The sword boy's respectful voice rang out. After he left, he carefully opened the door and brought back a large basin of hot water and all kinds of snacks, as well as some tools for washing up. Looking at this scene, the little emperor half sat on the bed. Her expression became serious. After the madness came clarity. She finally understood what she had done last night and what it represented. Most importantly, this place was not the Northern Qi Royal Palace. It was also not the legendary Taiping courtyard that Fan Xian had heavily guarded. Rather, it was a relatively unfamiliar place. The sword hut. Given Fan Xian's realm, he did not have to worry about someone eavesdropping. Last night, when the little emperor had indulged herself, she had not considered this problem. However, the arrival of the sword boy and the large basin of hot water made the little emperor remember clearly that the person living in the sword hut was no one else but a great grandmaster. Although the sword hut was large and the courtyard was deep, there were still sounds during the madness last night. Although Siga Jian was heavily injured and on the verge of death, since he was able to easily force back Lang Tiao and Yun Zhilan, presumably his cultivation was still there. It should not be difficult for him to hear clearly what had happened in this room. The Northern Qi Emperor was a woman. It was one thing for Fan Xian to know this secret. After all, he was the little emperor's first and second, and perhaps the only man in her life. If other people knew, the little emperor didn't know what terrifying fate would await her after she lost all standing and reputation. Under such a powerful impact, her face only became solemn and not deathly pale. This was already extraordinary and extremely valiant. Fan Xian did not look at her expression. With a slight smile, he brought the hot water to the side of the bed and began to help her scrub. He knew it was difficult for her to move. After this night, the distance between the two of them had long reached a negative. It was not just physically, but also psychologically. During these short intervals, the two guests of the sword hut did not have anything else to do. Other than combing their hair, holding hands, and picking at their palms and thighs, they could only talk. They talked about each other's strange lives, their childhoods that were different from everyone else in the world, how men dressed as women, how men looked like women, how they deceived the world to gain fame, how they sat on the throne, how they bathed, how they copied poetry, and so on. The little emperor and Fan Xian were equals. They seriously discussed each other's lives to see what things the other had done inappropriately. From the other's wisdom, they searched for an opportunity to make up for it. The night passed. The two of them had not yet turned white, but they were like old friends. They had not yet turned white, but their hearts were set. Other than the rubbing of the man and woman's bodies, there was also a kind of spiritual connection and comfort, as well as an exceptionally stimulating feeling of challenge, rippling through their hearts. The little emperor pulled up the thin blanket to cover her chest and stared at Fan Xian. Lowering her voice, she said angrily, "What if Sigu Jian finds out? I have said many times to be gentler." Hearing these words, Fan Xian, who had put down the basin of water and was drinking tea to moisten his throat, almost spat it out. He walked to the side of the bed and gently grabbed her chin to stroke it. In an even voice, he said, "The old man is about to die. Even if he guesses something, we won't admit it. What is there to be afraid of?" The situation was very strange. The little emperor coldly slapped his hand down and said, "If my identity is exposed, you know how big of a disaster it will be." Fan Xian fell silent. He knew that if the news that the Northern Qi Emperor was a woman got out, the world would probably fall into chaos. The Qing kingdom would not let go of this opportunity and would certainly use it to send out troops. "I've said many times that you have to trust me and cooperate with me. Leave all future matters to me." He placed his hands on the little emperor's bare shoulders and pressed them down slightly. In a sincere and unquestionable tone, he spoke. The aces outside the sword hut had already endured an entire night. The torches were gradually extinguished. Lang Qiao and the other Northern Qi aces stared coldly at the door of the sword hut. They didn't know how the emperor was inside and if he had suffered any harm. If he was not worried about Fan Xian or Sigu Jian going crazy, Lang Qiao would not have waited patiently outside the hut. He would have long led everyone in. Sigu Jian had already expressed his attitude. The disciples of the sword hut did not charge in, but they were shocked. They didn't know what had happened in the hut during this long night. As time passed, the patience of the people outside grew thinner and thinner. Yun Jilin silently watched Lang Qiao's gaze. He knew that if the sword hut still didn't give an explanation, they would immediately attack the hut again. In a few days, the Northern Qi army would probably also enter Dongyi. Since my teacher has made his stance clear, he will not let the emperor suffer any harm. Even if he is with Fan Xian, my teacher will not allow the Qing people to show any disrespect to the emperor in his eyes." Yun Jilin said in a heavy voice. Lang Qiao's mood relaxed slightly. Given Sigu Jian's grandmaster position and the situation in Dongyi, he would not just watch as his emperor was humiliated. After all, it was Sigu Jian who had invited them to open the hut. Lang Qiao was no longer worried about the emperor's safety. He had not thought that in one night, the emperor had already been bullied into a woman. Sigu Jian, that strange old creature, would not just watch as Fan Xian killed the Northern Qi Emperor. If the Northern Qi Emperor and Fan Xian were willing to fight and create chaos, this great grandmaster would not be able to do anything. Chapter 637. I'm truly amazing. Yesterday, it was 6,666 words again. A strange smile flashed and disappeared. Shock floated in this great grandmaster's eyes. Logically speaking, a grandmaster should have experienced countless earth-shattering events in his life. Even if Dong Mountain had collapsed in front of him, it probably would not have made his eyelids blink. However, this shock was clear. Fan Xian had been looking into Sigu Jian's eyes the entire time, so he was able to accurately grasp the thoughts in this figure's heart. Other than smiling bitterly to himself, he couldn't help but feel a sense of pride. The reason he'd been looking into Sigu Jian's eyes the entire time was because there was nowhere else on Sigu Jian's body to look at. This short old man was sitting in a wheelchair. The bones on the left side of his face were broken and deeply sunken in. His left arm was broken as well. His sleeves were empty and fluttered in the wind. Although the large hemp clothes covered his body and the extent of his injuries was unknown, it was still a particularly frightening sight to think about. This was the first time in Fan Xian's life that he had seen Sigu Jian, the most valiant person in the world, the sword saint who had protected Dongyi for decades. In his imagination, this grandmaster-level figure, even if he was not as ethereal as an immortal, would at least have a sense of transcendence. However, he had not expected that the Sigu Jian who appeared in front of him would be like this. It was wretched and pitiful. Only his eyes were filled with a natural ruthlessness and an unyielding sword intent. Fan Xian could only stare into his eyes, terrified that he would be disrespectful. The atmosphere in the room was very strange. Facing a legendary figure, Fan Xian should have appeared more excited. However, he could not become excited no matter what. Perhaps it was because he knew the other person was going to die in a few days. Perhaps it was because he had lived with Uncle Wu Zhu since he was young. Or perhaps it was because his parents were both incredible people, no less than great grandmasters. The sword boy pushed the wheelchair into the morning light. The faint light clearly illuminated the terrifying wound on Sigu Jian's face. The sword boy obediently retreated. It was Sigu Jian who broke the silence first. After staring at Fan Xian for a moment, he sighed in a raspy voice, "Admirable, admirable." This great grandmaster had the reputation of being an idiot since he was a child. After he had mastered his swordsmanship, he moved unhindered between heaven and earth. He never had any thoughts of bending his waist. He pierced through the sky and pierced through the earth. He was very arrogant. Even on Dong Mountain, when he had been grievously injured by the Qing Emperor and Yi Liuyun's combined attack, he was still stubborn and laughed to his heart's content. He refused to lower his head. He was the most powerful person in the world. It was basically impossible for him to feel admiration for someone. Thus, when he repeatedly expressed his admiration for Fan Xian's face couldn't help but redden. He was rather embarrassed. Fan Xian knew what this admiration meant. He did not admire the Qing Emperor or Yi Luyun, but he admired him. It was because of the voices that had come out last night. "You're welcome. You're welcome." He coughed to hide his embarrassment and turned around. The morning light shone down, enveloping both the old man and the young man. Fan Xian naturally and habitually stood by the side of the wheelchair. He furrowed his brows slightly as he felt this scene. A strange feeling welled up in his heart. The pitiful, short, and thin, injured person on the chair was the legendary tyrannical and murderous Sigu Jian. The sunlight shone through Sigu Jian's brows and glowed with a white light. It was as if his brows had suddenly turned white. Fan Xian stared in a daze at the other side of the face that was still intact. He suddenly realized that this great grandmaster was not as old as he had imagined. 3 years ago, when Fan Xian had fled Dong Mountain, only Yi Luyun had been on the boat. Regardless of whether it was Ku He or Sigu Jian, he had not encountered either of them. Of course, if he had encountered them at that time, he probably would not have been able to escape back to Jingdou. Thus, he did not know what had happened on the mountain at the time. He did not see the wretched sight of a sword light shining through the jade peak, killing all the tiger guards, and blood covering the mountain path. But this did not affect his faint fear of Sigu Jian. He knew that this great grandmaster was somewhat crazy. If he could kill 100 tiger guards, he could easily kill him. Fan Xian had never met Sigu Jian before, but he was no stranger to this great grandmaster. After he entered Jingdou, Dongyi's sword hut had become the Overwatch Council, eldest princess, and even the Qing court and emperor's favorite scapegoat. In any case, this great grandmaster did not leave the sword hut, so he could only allow the Qing kingdom's shameless people to pour dirty water on him. Because of the eldest princess, the Overwatch Council led by Fan Xian and Dongyi's sword hut had carried out a life and death battle during those years. Starting from the Battle of Nyalan Street, they both saw each other as enemies and each used their own methods. It was only when Fan Xian went to Jiangnan and used the power of the shadow that he managed to chase Yun Zhilan and his people back. Fan Xian knew that this was because Sigu Jian had always disdained to deal with him. If he had truly wanted to kill him, perhaps he would have died many years ago. After this, Fan Xian successfully inherited the palace treasury. At this moment, Sigu Jian appeared particularly like a mature politician and not an idiot with great martial power. Sigu Jian put down his past grievances and sent his favorite last disciple, 13th Wang, to express his attitude to Fan Xian. Thus, Fan Xian was very familiar with Sigu Jian. Or rather, he thought he was familiar with Sigu Jian. Meeting him now, he realized that Sigu Jian was still a stranger to him, an unfathomable and terrifying stranger with an unknown temperament. There seemed to be an invisible pressure in the sword hut emanating from the injured person in the wheelchair, making it difficult for Fan Xian to breathe. "I didn't kill you back then, not because I looked down on you," Sigu Jian suddenly said mockingly in a hoarse voice. "The reason I didn't kill you is simple. It's just that you don't know it." Once Sigu Jian opened his mouth, the pressure filling the courtyard weakened slightly. Fan Xian relaxed and quickly said, "Please advise me. Your mother's surname is Yi. Isn't this reason clear?" Sigu Jian furrowed his brows. It seemed that he had not expected Fan Xian to be so stupid. He cursed angrily. Fan Xian shrugged. He truly couldn't understand this reason. He had not gone deep into the sword hut to catch up with Sigu Jian. Rather, he wanted to talk about the future of Dongyi and the world. The number of people who had the right to discuss the world had gradually decreased. Kui was already dead. Yi Luyun had truly escaped. After the Dong Mountain incident, many people had died. In the sword hut, there was the Northern Qi Emperor, Fan Xian, and Sigu Jian. They were all people who had the right to sit and discuss the world. "I trust that you have already read the proposal I had 13th Wang bring back." Proposal was a new term. In the 4th year of the Qin calendar, Fan Xian had once had Fan Xizha write a proposal to open the Dongbu bookstore. This year, he had also written one and given it to Sigu Jian. He wanted to convince this strange and ruthless great-grandmaster to accept his proposal. "I didn't read it," Sigu Jian said indifferently. With these words, Fan Xian's heart was like a heavy blow. He didn't know what Sigu Jian was thinking. He had thought he would be able to move Sigu Jian a little with the proposal he had painstakingly drafted. If Sigu Jian didn't even look at it, what was there to talk about? "The Qin Kingdom's diplomatic group hasn't arrived yet. What are you in such a rush for?" Sigu Jian looked at him mockingly. Fan Xian fell silent. Suddenly, he said, "In my letter last year, I reported to you that I had confidence in controlling Northern Qi. If you trust me, I can also preserve Dongyi's independence to the greatest degree." Sigu Jian looked at him calmly. His twisted and sunken, terrifying face contrasted with his calm eyes. It appeared particularly quiet, but there was a glimmer of a craziness that made one shiver. "That kid is actually a woman. I had not expected it. That is why I said I admired you earlier. If you want to convince me that you have the ability to control the entire situation based on this, it seems to be a bit lacking," Sigu Jian said in a raspy voice. Sigu Jian mockingly said in a raspy voice, "Your father is not a normal person. If you can't satisfy him, how will you fool him?" The Qing Emperor's request was to swallow Dongyi into his territory. Sigu Jian knew that after his death, Dongyi and the surrounding vassal states would no longer be able to protect themselves. They could only wait for their fate of being swallowed. Since Northern Qi had come out to cause trouble, Dongyi would have to wait for the right price and hope to be able to preserve themselves as much as possible. These were in themselves two completely different directions. He had to satisfy both the emperor and Sigu Jian. For Fan Xian, this was a difficult task. As the saying goes, follow your brother's feelings and lose your sister-in-laws. Even if the girls in the brothel benefited from both sides, it would be difficult for them to reach such a stage. The key was still Sigu Jian. As long as he nodded, everything could be discussed. Fan Xian thought of this. Very naturally, he pushed the wheelchair and began to walk on the yellow dirt paths around the sword grave. He pushed the heavily injured Sigu Jian to bask in the sun. Sigu Jian closed his eyes and enjoyed the sunlight landing on his body. Suddenly, he said, "You're very skilled at pushing the wheelchair. You're better than those children. Why don't you stay and take care of me these few months?" Fan Xian smiled and replied, "It's fine to take care of you for a few months. However, you have to look at those things. The tens of thousands of people in Dongyi are all looking at you and waiting for you. You have to have some ideas. As for pushing the wheelchair, I'm used to pushing it in Jingdo. Oh, I remember. That old dog's leg was broken a long time ago." Sigu Jian suddenly sighed. "During these 20 years, the biggest mistake I made was actually getting the wrong target. I had always seen your emperor as my biggest target. I had never thought that if I had killed Qin Pingping at the beginning, perhaps your emperor would not be so arrogant." There was a powerful confidence hidden in the calm words. It was as if Sigu Jian could kill such a terrifying figure as the director of the Overwatch Council, if he wanted to. For some reason, the sea breeze around the sword grave paused slightly. Following the sword intent in Sigu Jian's words, Fan Xian's heart felt as if it had been stabbed ruthlessly. His face became deathly pale. Only now did he feel the true realm of a great grandmaster. With a thought, the surrounding environment also reacted. Killing intent rose and was difficult to bear. His hands pressed forcefully against the back of the wheelchair, forcefully supporting himself. With great difficulty, he said, "Given your cultivation, if you focused on killing Director Chun, you would not be able to live for long. The problem is if you killed him, Yi Luyan would come to kill the people of Dongyi." He breathed with difficulty for a moment, and then slowly said, "Even if everyone in your family dies, you still have your disciple. Dongyi still has the manner of the master of the city. Sir Sword Saint, just as the emperor said, strange creatures like great grandmasters should not exist in this world. Since you have appeared, then you cannot act recklessly. You're just a dead object to maintain the balance." That makes sense," Sigu Jian said with his head lowered. Fan Xian continued to smile with difficulty. "Sometimes, I feel fortunate on behalf of the people under heaven. Regardless of whether it is Master Ku He or you, there will always be things on your mind, such as Northern Qi and Dongyi. If you were truly an idiot who did things according to your own preferences, but also had the power of a great grandmaster, I'm afraid the entire world would fall into chaos." "Of course," he said with emphasis. "If that was the case, I would not vainly hope to convince you of anything." Sigu Jian was silent for a long time. He then suddenly opened his mouth and said, "Last night, you gave me many surprises. So your so-called trump card is on that little emperor. I admit that you have the right to negotiate with me. I also admit that I do care about Dongyi's future. Perhaps this is a habit that I will take with me even if I die. I am used to protecting the people of this city." He turned his head and said in a raspy voice, "As long as you satisfy me, I will also satisfy you. Surrender in name, garrison, unchanged for 50 years. Fan Xian's heart beat faster. Looking into his eyes, he threw out a few words with unusual speed. When he was in Qingzhou, he had already said these words to 13th Wang. Now, he was just repeating them in front of Sigu Jian. "Garrison?" Sigu Jian laughed. His laughter was particularly sharp and pierced Fan Xian's eyes with a sharp pain. No matter how he used Jinqi to protect his body, he was unable to block it. His face was deathly pale. With a muffled grunt, he cursed, "You won't kill me. What is the meaning of torturing me like this?" Hearing these words, Sigu Jian involuntarily shrugged and said, "I'm just laughing out of habit. What does it have to do with torturing? The Northern Qi Emperor is actually a woman. TSK, TSK. Sigu Jian seemed to have not heard Fan Xian's suggestion at all. He was still immersed in this reality. It was as if he was happy that he had finally learned a certain secret before he died. Fan Xian finally realized the strangeness of this great grandmaster's personality. In a flash, he remembered that Zhang Daodu was still catching up on sleep in her room. He wondered if this great grandmaster had been eavesdropping all night. His expression became strange. He unconsciously looked under Sigu Jian's eyes to see if he had deep dark circles or corns. Sigu Jian also looked over. Looking at the dark circles around Fan Xian's eyes, He furrowed his brows and said, "Even if it's a female emperor who only does it once every few years, you have to take it easy. If you want to die from indulgence, even if I wanted to, I wouldn't be able to." After these words were said, Fan Xian was greatly embarrassed. However, a thought flashed through his mind. He heard the last sentence clearly. His lips trembled slightly. He didn't know how to respond. The morning light gradually brightened and cast the shadow of the wheelchair on the sword grave. It was like it was pierced by countless swords. It looked very pitiful. Fan Xian looked calmly at the shadow and suddenly thought of the familiar figure he had seen behind the second door when he had been chased by Lang Tiao and Yun Jilan. At that time, he had even thought that person had come. Looking at the shadow in the sword grave, only then did he know his guess was wrong. At that time, the person who had appeared behind the second door was Sigu Jian himself. He had not thought that the feeling of him sitting in the wheelchair would be so similar to Chun Pingping's. Seeming to guess what he was thinking, Sigu Jian coldly said, "Under my eyes, no one can touch you." However, Fan Xian did not feel a sliver of safety. He looked calmly at Sigu Jian and quickly analyzed in his heart. Suddenly, he said, "No one can, but that doesn't mean no one dares." Yun Jilan dared to put 13th Wang under house arrest, make a private deal with the Qi people, and chase after me in front of you. Although Sigu Jian had casually chased Yun Jilan and Lang Tiao out of the hut and intimidated everyone, given his understanding of the great Grandmaster realm, Sigu Jian did not need to appear behind the second door. His attack at the time only proved one thing. Sigu Jian's present strength was no longer what it had been at its peak. Right now, I cannot leave the hut because no one dares to push me. Sigu Jian's gaze became strange. He had once again guessed Fan Xian's thoughts. Your father and Yi Luyun have injured me too badly. I should have died a long time ago. Luckily, I've survived until now. However, I can no longer move. I can only sit in this damn wheelchair. Even if I want to kill people, I can't run anymore. As long as those people who want to be killed by me stay a bit further away from me, there's nothing I can do. A glimmer of sadness suddenly flashed through Fan Xian's heart. Such a great grandmaster had fallen to such a state in the end, sealing himself in the sword hut and unable to leave. Of course, no one dares to try, Sigu Jian said with his eyes closed. As long as you are by my side, you are still safe. Fan Xian suddenly opened his mouth and said, "How many more days can you live?" Sigu Jian abruptly opened his eyes. It was as if he had been angered by this bold question. His gaze pierced straight into the depths of Fan Xian's heart like a heavenly sword. Fan Xian's eyes felt a piercing pain. He quickly closed them. After a long time, Sigu Jian faintly said, "There's about 100 more days." Fan Xian opened his eyes. He didn't dare to look at this great grandmaster who had difficulty controlling his emotions. Sigu Jian stared in a daze at the deep pit under his feet and the sword swaying in the wind. He tilted his ear to listen to the crisp, clanging sounds. No one knew what he was thinking. Perhaps he was thinking of the countless beautiful scenes in this life, the countless times he had attacked with the sword, the countless victories, and the people who had died under his sword. His expression gradually became dim. He had only lost once in his life on Dong Mountain. However, he had lost so thoroughly that he had no choice but to carry on such a humiliating conversation with a junior beside the sword pit. I once relied on the sword in my hand to control Dongyi and the countless vassal states around it, Sigu Jian suddenly said coldly. Sigu Jian suddenly said coldly. Only in the last moments of my life did I realize that the only things I could control were this grass hut and this pit. Fan Xian lowered his head and bowed deeply. He knew that Sigu Jian had finally made up his mind. This bow is to thank the Sword Saint for his mercy on behalf of the Qing soldiers and the people of Dongyi. No need to thank me. Sigu Jian suddenly laughed self-mockingly and said, "If the person from the Qing kingdom had not been you, I would not have agreed." Fan Xian smiled and thought, the Northern Qi Emperor had come thousands of li, yet you avoided meeting him. This meant that you already had a plan in your heart. Why did you have to say such things? The present situation was set. If Sigu Jian wanted Dongyi to avoid the disaster of war, there was only one path. Sigurd looked at the happy young man beside him. His mood was also strange. He had to admit that although this kid's strength was lacking, his luck was not bad. He was able to use one night to solve most of the biggest problem, the pressure on Northern Qi. He smiled again in his heart. This young man still didn't know why his attitude was always there. Sigurd really wanted to see Fan Xian's angry expression when he solved the problem at the last moment. However, at that time, perhaps he would already be dead. He thought gloomily. He then turned his head and looked at Fan Xian. You have to believe me. If it wasn't for you, even if your emperor personally came to beg me on his knees, I would still not agree to the Qin Kingdom's conditions. Fan Xian did not understand. Chapter 638. The monthly votes are 250 votes away from third place. Is truly an unlucky number. Everyone, please help me move up a little more, a little more. Thank you. What is your mother's surname? My mother's surname is Yi. Before coming to Dongyi, Fan Xian had expected that he would certainly run into people, matters, or pasts related to the old Yi family. He knew that after his mother, Yi Qingmei, came to this world, her first stop was Dongyi. On the night he was 16, Uncle Wu Zhu had told him everything about Yi Qingmei for the first time, everything that this amnesiac remembered. The Yi family's business began in Dongyi. The first fortune they seized in the world was also in Dongyi. Later, for some reason, Yi Qingmei chose the Qin Kingdom, which was not very powerful at the time. Perhaps it could be said that she chose the unusually powerful emperor. Yi Qingmei left Dongyi. Fan Xian didn't know if she ever returned. He knew that this large city must have been very important to her. However, he had not thought that Sigurd would suddenly bring up the past and use such an awkward and crude excuse. Forget it, forget it. Fan Xian glanced at Sigurd and smiled bitterly. I know what you want to say. However, she is she, and I am me. Can it be split open? Is your mother willing to see Dongyi, which she once fought for, become something no different from any other county in the Qin Kingdom? Sigurd smiled mockingly. One cannot forget one's roots. You are her son. You're also a Dongyi person. Fan Xian raised his brows and simply sat down in an empty space beside the wheelchair. His two legs dangled in the sword grave, swinging around emptily. With a cold smile, he said, although I did not personally see what happened on Dong Mountain, I still know some details. I have also heard the words you once said to Uncle Wu Zhu. You want me to be the master of Dongyi? Fan Xian turned his head and glanced at Sigurd. With slight mockery, he said, just because I am half a Dongyi person? Did you think of such a response after hiding in the sword hut for so long? Don't forget, in the end, I am a Qin person. My relationship with the emperor has already been decided. Don't expect to use your identity as the city lord to stir up his majesty's suspicions and force me to break off relations with him. He waved his arm and said calmly, impossible. Of course, I will not be the master of Dongyi. Sigurd coldly said, you are so afraid of death. Of course, you are afraid that your emperor will kill you. I have never hoped that you would take over Dongyi. I am only reminding you that you do not need to innately think for the benefit of the Qin people. I'm only comforting you. Even if you think for Dongyi, it is not a treasonous thing. I have thought enough on behalf of the people of Dongyi. Fan Xian did not budge an inch. The words I said earlier, do you think that other than me, who would give up so many benefits? Who would risk His Majesty's wrath to persuade him to accept these conditions? This is enough. Sigurd closed his eyes and slowly said, perhaps you've never thought about how your mother died? In the depths of the sword hut, countless swords in the large pit began to tremble at the same time. They gave off a mournful cry and trembled endlessly. It was as if they would all break in the next moment. Fan Xian's legs, which were suspended in the sword grave, also stopped moving in this instant. A serious expression gradually appeared between his brows. An indescribable emotion rose in his eyes. There was no one around. Given Sigurd realm, he was not worried that someone would eavesdrop. However, Fan Xian still felt his heart begin to tighten. With each twitch, it was difficult to resist the pain. He took a deep breath. His face was unnaturally white. In a quiet voice, he said, "Or perhaps, do you have any ideas that can convince others?" "No," Sigu Jian said coldly. Sigu Jian coldly said, "I am only guessing. How could someone like your mother die so mysteriously? If a pig-headed empress of the Qin kingdom or that old whore the Empress Dowager could kill your mother, then your mother would not be your mother." Just like that, Ku He also guessed. Chen Pingping also guessed. Why can't I guess? Fan Xian's lips trembled slightly. In a quiet voice, he said, "It's best not to talk about guessing. It will kill someone." "Is that so?" Sigu Jian suddenly laughed loudly. His laughter was filled with endless viciousness and mockery. "It is rare to see someone as afraid of death as you." Fan Xian knew what he was looking down on. Without changing his expression, he said, "To be able to easily kill one's entire family, such a person is rare." Sigu Jian's expression changed. A ruthless light appeared in his eyes. It was as if he could attack and kill Fan Xian at any moment. A heart-rending sword intent began to spread through the air again. This time, Fan Xian did not seem to feel anything. He glanced at him disdainfully and said, "If you did it, then you did it. Are you afraid of people talking about it? As for me, you don't need to worry about my matters." He furrowed his brows tightly and sighed helplessly. "Sometimes I truly don't understand what you important figures, old creatures, are thinking. Why must you push me to the opposite side of the Emperor? Do you really think I have the power to oppose him? Most importantly, do you really think that I'm willing to resist him?" He looked at Sigu Jian's angry eyes and shook his head. "No matter what, he is still my father, so I don't understand what you people think." "Father?" Sigu Jian shrunk his body into the wheelchair. His entire person was like a sharp sword that had returned to its sheath. There was no longer any light. "If I really get angry, I can kill both father and mother." Fan Xian's heart trembled slightly. He smiled bitterly and shook his head. He thought to himself that there was truly no need to discuss such things as human ethics with this idiot. As for the true cause of Yi Qingmei's death, at the most crucial moment of the Jingdo Rebellion, before the eldest princess died, she had pointed it out to Fan Xian. Chen Pingping's actions, whether intentional or not, seemed to prove this point. However, Chen Pingping did not say it clearly. Minister Fan also did not say it clearly. After these two old comrades, who had personally experienced this matter, suspected each other for many years, they finally set their sights on a certain person. However, they did not want to tell Fan Xian this matter clearly. Other than Sigu Jian, who feared nothing and only wanted to see the Qing kingdom go into trouble, no one tried to lead Fan Xian onto a path of no return just because of speculation. "You are about to die. Don't hope to see the Qing kingdom fall into internal chaos before you die." Fan Xian nodded his head slightly. It was as if he wanted to convince Sigu Jian and himself. "Accept my sincerity and peacefully wait for your death. I will look after the millions of people in Dongyi well for you." Sigu Jian stared coldly in front of him for a long time. He then said, "Believe me, one day you will walk the path that the wretched heavens have arranged for you. I am going to defy the heavens." Fan Xian said with a loud laugh. He laughed until he began to cough. His face flushed red, and he cut a wretched figure. Sigu Jian glanced at him disdainfully. Fan Xian was angered by this gaze. Gritting his teeth, he said in an icy voice, "Regardless of whether it is Ku, he, or you, it seems that before they died, they all placed their hopes on me. Is this not a ridiculous thing in itself? This is not the will of heaven. It is just the selfish thoughts of you major figures." "Selfish?" Sigu Jian shook his head. "I don't know what that old baldy did before he died." Fan Xian shrugged and said, "He sent his best disciple to Jingdo to extend Chen Pingping's life. It looks like he is counting on Chen Pingping to become the cause of internal chaos in the Qin kingdom." "Ha ha ha ha." Sigu Jian couldn't resist roaring with laughter. As he laughed, he cursed, "So, that's what that damn baldy thinks. It looks like he is counting on the Qing emperor and Chen Pingping to make a huge ruckus. You will be stuck in the middle, unable to be a person, and then he will force you to go crazy. Your judgment is not bad. He's the same as me. We both place our hopes on you. However, Sigu Jian twisted his neck and said disdainfully, Kuhi is too stupid. It would have been better to directly force you on such a matter. Why go through Chun Pingping? Kuhi underestimated that old dog's loyalty to the Qing emperor. Please, I am right in front of you. Isn't it a bit boring for you to directly force me to rebel? As Fan Xian sighed, he pointed at the large pit in front of him and the sword that appeared particularly old after being weathered by the wind and rain. I clearly know that there is a pit in front of me. Am I still going to jump in? Sigu Jian did not directly answer this question. He shrunk his body and said, Actually, regardless of whether or not you admit that you are a Dongi person, I am not too worried about the stupid people in this city. Don't forget, Miss Ning is an Eastern barbarian through and through. That first prince of yours can't be like you and refuse to admit his origins. Fan Xian shrugged. He knew what he said was correct. The emperor only had 3 sons left. 2 of the grown ones had too many ties to Dongi. If the Qing kingdom truly sent troops to attack, it would indeed be troublesome. The most important problem is that there are many pits in one's life. You clearly know that it is in front of you, but you have no choice but to jump in with your eyes wide open. Sigu Jian pursed his lips and pointed one arm toward the depths of the sword pit. His entire body was mixed with the aura of an old man and an irresistible pressure. Faintly, he said, 3 years ago, I told Jalan that even though I knew that there was a pit in front of me, I was still going to jump in. He was talking about the Dong Mountain matter. Regardless of whether it was Ku, he, or Sigu Jian, before they set off to assassinate the emperor, they had both thought about it countless times. They had both suspected that it was a pit. However, time waited for no one. The situation was pressing. The 2 great grandmasters had no choice but to jump. They had fallen wretchedly. Fan Xian was silent for a moment. He then said, There's nothing more to say about these things. After the diplomatic group arrives, what needs to be done has to be done. You don't need to worry about my matters. So, shouldn't we talk about happier things right now? Happier? Sigu Jian suddenly cursed angrily. I am about to die. I haven't left this broken hut in 2 years. How can I be happy? Oh, you are truly pitiful. Although your cultivation is there, it is difficult for you to move. You don't dare to casually leave the hut and have been forced to sit for years by your eldest disciple, Fan Xian said mockingly. Fan Xian laughed mockingly and said, Back then, King Wei Ling was starved to death by his own son in the Li Palace. If Yun Jilan also did the same thing, you, a great grandmaster, would die too unsightly a death. I am not useless like King Wei Ling Wang. Sigu Jian's eyes were sunken and suffused with a cold light. I just don't want to go out. What does that have to do with Jilan? Sitting in a wheelchair in the sun is indeed a pitiful feeling of being old and about to die. However, you have to get used to it. Fan Xian knew he was speaking the truth. Even if he was a great grandmaster about to die, if he wanted to leave the hut, who dared to stop him? Who could stop him? That makes sense. Sigu Jian suddenly lowered his head to glance at him. The sun is pretty good today. Why don't you push me out for a walk? Fan Xian froze where he stood. He didn't know how many aces were watching him covetously outside the sword hut. Even if Sigu Jian spoke to protect him, walking in Dongi, the difficulty was a bit too great. The Northern Qi Emperor is still in the hut, he said quietly with his head lowered. Isn't that your woman? Let's walk around together. Sigu Jian coughed and called over a child. He went to the room to invite the Northern Qi Emperor out. Before long, the little emperor, who had already put on her clothes, slowly walked over from the other side of the sword grave. From a distance, she saw Sigu Jian sitting in a wheelchair, as well as Fan Xian sitting rudely by the sword grave. The clothes from last night had long been torn. The sword hut had prepared well. The little emperor, Zhang Daodu, was wearing light green clothing. It did not look seductive at all. It only had the aura of a weak scholar. Coming to their side, the little emperor smiled slightly and said in a low voice, It is indeed difficult to see the sword saint's face. Sigu Jian tilted his head slightly and rudely did not reply to this question. Instead, he waved his hand and chased the child far away. After a long time, the corners of his lips twitched. Looking at the Northern Shi Emperor, he quietly said, "Greetings, Your Majesty." The Sword Saint is too polite. The little emperor's gaze didn't even glance at Fan Xian sitting on her. This kind of composure was truly first-rate in the world. However, her calm exterior was easily broken by Sigurd. This great grandmaster smiled and gazed at the Northern Shi Emperor with a complicated expression. In a raspy voice, he said, "There is nothing good to see an old creature like me. However, a female emperor is the first in 1,000 years. I'm very happy to be able to see Your Majesty with my own eyes." After these words were said, the Northern Shi Emperor's expression immediately changed. She stared angrily and coldly at Fan Xian. However, Fan Xian did not have any reaction. Sigurd gazed at the little emperor and said with a slight smile, "First, I already know that Your Majesty is a woman. Second, I am about to die and won't go around telling people. I am a strange person who likes to keep candy in my own box and not share it with others." Sigurd didn't look at the little emperor, whose expression changed endlessly. He continued in a quiet voice, "Third, because I am about to die, we can speak more directly between us. Earlier, I was urging Fan Xian to rebel. I wonder if Your Majesty is interested in this suggestion." The little emperor took a deep breath and forcefully pushed down the slight fear and unease in her heart. Calmly, she said, "I am very interested in this suggestion. If Sir Fan Jr.'s rebellion fails, you can come live in Northern Qi." "I also think so, regardless of whether it is being the master of the city or a male empress. Presumably, it is both more comfortable than being the Qing emperor's servant." However, he is not willing to agree. Fan Xian sat by the edge of the pit beside the sword grave and said, "A scholar's rebellion cannot be accomplished in 10 years. Don't you know that I am the most famous scholar in the world?" "Yes." Sigurd smiled strangely and looked at the little emperor. "That is why we have decided not to continue this topic. Instead, we're going to the seaside in the city for a walk. I wonder if Your Majesty is interested." "Can I say no?" the little emperor asked angrily. Fan Xian replied from below, "Of course not." Sigurd was the god of Dongi. Regardless of whether it was actively or passively, a distance was always maintained between gods. It was clear that this great grandmaster in the wheelchair had not come out to casually look at the street view in many years. His entire being appeared to be rather excited. Fan Xian and the little emperor walked slowly behind the wheelchair. Occasionally, they would glance at each other but didn't speak. They were actually very shocked that the three of them had so easily left the sword hut without the sword hut and Northern Qi aces discovering any trace. Even if it was Sigurd, it still shocked Fan Xian that he could do this. Walking through the streets and alleys of Dongi, Fan Xian could clearly sense that no one was following them. Given Sigurd's realm, if someone followed them for more than a moment, they would probably immediately be hacked into countless balls of blood by the rootless sword intent on the wheelchair. The three of them came to a large tree on the outskirts of the city. The tree crown stretched out widely. The green color blocked out the sky and sun. They rested there, hiding from the blazing sun. Chapter 639. Happy birthday to Master Yuan. I was forced to do this. In the depths of spring, all kinds of trees were stretching their branches and spitting out green leaves. Dongi was close to the seashore. The moist sea breeze blew day and night, making spring come earlier and fiercer here than in other places. The period of time for spring to accumulate was also longer. No one knew how many years this big green tree on the outskirts of the city had been growing here. The trunk was tall and straight, but it did not have the intention of piercing the sky. Countless green leaves gathered at the crown of the tree to form a large canopy, appearing exceptionally beautiful and benevolent. It blocked the sun in the sky, casting a shadow over the people entering and exiting the city. This tree was very large. The area of its shadow was several mu of land. Many people were resting under the tree. Under the tree were roots that protruded from the soil. They were like the thick body of a dragon, steady and solid. Sigurd, Fan Xian, and the little emperor rested temporarily beside these roots. This strange combination did not attract the attention of passers-by. It was probably because there had always been many strange people in Dongi. Fan Xian sat on the tree root and felt the shade under his butt. He didn't know what kind of tree the tree behind him was and couldn't be bothered to investigate. He only lowered his head to look for ants or dung-killing cockroaches moving balls of dung. He didn't find anything. How old was she at that time? 5 or 6? 7 or 8? Sigu Jian sat in the wheelchair and furrowed his brows. He thought for a long time. It seemed that because of the passage of time, his memory had become blurry. He spat on the ground and said, "In any case, it was just a little girl." "How old were you at that time?" "I should have been in my teens." Sigu Jian scratched his head. "You know, my brain has never been very good. It's always hard for me to remember such complicated questions." "I don't think my age is a complicated question," Fan Xian said. "Geniuses are always different from others in certain areas," Sigu Jian said with a cold smile. He clearly did not care about Fan Xian's mockery. The other side of a genius is an idiot. Fan Xian glanced at him lazily. "Of course, everyone knows you were an idiot when you were young." Sigu Jian didn't say anything. He only met Fan Xian's gaze. He tried to find some shadow of his past in the crevices of the tree roots. The little Emperor Zhan Daodu stood coldly to the side, looking at the old man and the young man's stupidity. She felt disapproval in her heart. The three of them had traveled peacefully. Based on the theories of the secular world, the little emperor's status was the most noble. It was clear that neither Sigu Jian nor Fan Xian cared much about this. Sigu Jian and Fan Xian seemed to be interested in looking for ants. They stayed the entire time under the large tree the entire time. It was as if they of the green were to die. The little emperor furrowed her brows slightly. She thought about how the officials outside the sword hut were probably still worried about her. Additionally, she didn't know what would happen next. She was also worried whether or not the two of them would reveal her fate. Feeling slightly worried, she quietly said, "Lady Yi is no longer here. Even if you watch her for another 3 years, you cannot hope for her to come back to life." These words seemed to be stating a matter, but they were also somewhat heart-wrenching. The little emperor's intelligence and reaction speed were fully displayed at this moment. In the sword hut, Sigu Jian had only briefly mentioned the matter of persuading Fan Xian to rebel. She had caught on to some vague clues and tried to point it out. With these words, Sigu Jian and Fan Xian both raised their heads and glanced at her, making her feel a little flustered. Fan Xian shrugged and said, "I just think ants are more interesting than people." Sigu Jian looked at Fan Xian and sighed in admiration. "When your mother accompanied me to find ants, someone asked us this. She also answered this way." Following Sigu Jian's joyful narration, Fan Xian smiled. The scene from many years ago seemed to rise before his eyes. An idiot with a runny nose squatting under a big tree, watching ants moving and fighting. He might even untie the belt around his waist and pee on the ant nest. The passers-by and residents of Dongi all knew the identity of this idiot. When they passed him, they all had expressions of pity and disgust in their eyes, but no one was willing to go up and talk to him. Then, a blind young servant holding the hand of a little girl came from afar to Dongi. They came to this big tree and found the idiot, who was so focused that he didn't care what was happening around him. The little girl, who was carved from jade, squatted curiously by the idiot's side and asked, "What are you looking at?" The idiot glanced at her impatiently and said, "I'm looking at ants." The little girl made an "oh" sound and began to accompany him in looking at ants. They watched for a long time. Finally, someone at the side couldn't stand it anymore and reminded the young servant that this idiot was the young master of a major family in the city. He was just an idiot. Don't let your young mistress be stupid with him. After the little girl heard these words, she didn't stand up. She smiled and said, "I just feel that sometimes ants are more interesting than people." It was clear that the meaning hidden in these words was much more mature than the age this little body showed. However, the passers-by and people under the tree didn't notice this. They just wondered whose family this young mistress belonged to. She was so pretty and clean, like a fairy who had walked out of painting. She was squatting with the most famous idiot of the master of the city. They couldn't bear to watch any longer. The little girl waved her hand. The blind young servant, who had been as cold as a block of ice, also squatted down beside the two of them. Although he didn't want to squat, there was no difference between squatting and standing. Since she wanted him to squat, then he would squat. At that time, there were 3 of us. Sigurd was continuing his memories. He scratched his slightly itchy face and said in a raspy voice, "We watched the ants fight for half a day. Then, I invited them to my home as guests." "Your home? My stupid father used to be the master of Dongi. Don't you know?" "Oh, I've heard of it. However, that was many years ago. Your stupid father died to your sort a long time ago." I didn't think of it right away. The manor of the master of the city was very large and luxurious. Sigurd suddenly opened his mouth and smiled. "But the place I lived in was like a dog kennel because I was an idiot. My stupid father hated me the most. Furthermore, my mother was only a serving girl. Do you understand what I'm saying?" I've read many similar novels." Fansia nodded. No one in Dongi dared to discuss Sigurd past, but it didn't mean the Overwatch Council didn't do research in this area. He had a clear understanding of Sigurd past. He knew what kind of humiliating and belittling the idiot had lived in the manor of the master of the city. However, it was only now that he learned that Sigurd's birth mother was a serving girl. That serving girl had probably died many years ago. "Your mother and Wu Zhu were the first friends I made in my life," Sigurd suddenly said seriously. "Although the place I lived in was terrible and I couldn't even bring out a cup of tea, they didn't look down on me and still went with me. Perhaps it was because I was an idiot at the time, so I didn't think there was a problem. But it was clear that many people in the manor thought there was a problem. They could not accept 2 people of unknown origins living in the manor, particularly with the idiot young master. After a few days, Yi Zi and Wu Zhu left the manor. I didn't mind. In any case, I had to go out during the day to see ants. On the way, I would go to the room they rented to play. This is truly the first time I learned that you once had such interactions with my mother and Uncle Wu Zhu." Sigurd furrowed his brows and said in a cold voice, "Did Wu Zhu never mention to you what happened in Dongi?" "No." Fan Xian sat on a tree root and picked up a thin branch. Unconsciously picking at the dirt, he replied, "Later on, my memory became much worse." "Oh, Wu Zhu, this kid, his memory actually deteriorated?" Sigurd suddenly laughed loudly. "Isn't that similar to my idiotic appearance back then?" Fan Xian glared at him. Shortly after, he smiled bitterly and shook his head. "Do you know where my mother and Uncle Wu Zhu came from?" This was something that had troubled him for a dozen years. Although he could vaguely guess a little, and Xiao and had mentioned it a little before his death in the precipice of Shi Mountain outside Shanjing. Xiao's narration before his death only explained his mother's origins and did not mention Uncle Wu Zhu. In Xiao's narration, he had suffered thousands of li and entered the outskirts of the temple. Then, they had seen Yi Qingmei. The 2 of them had rescued Yi Qingmei from the temple, but had been separated halfway. At that time, Yi Qingmei was only 4 years old. It had been 2 years, or even longer, since Sigurd had seen her in Dongi. During this time, what had Yi Qingmei been doing? How had Uncle Wu Zhu come to her side? In Xiao's memories, he had once mentioned that Yi Qingmei seemed to be deeply worried about someone in the temple. She could not let it go, so she left decisively. Was that person Uncle Wu Zhu? Hearing Fan Xian's question, Sigurd suddenly became very quiet. A moment later, he faintly said, "At that time, it was impossible for me to know where they came from or where they were going. Later, I slowly found out." He turned his head slightly and stared at Fan Xian with his unfathomably calm eyes. "Do you still not know where Wu Zhu came from?" Fan Xian lowered his head and was silent for a long time. Uncle Wu Zhu was a strange creature. Uncle Wu Zhu would not age. Uncle Wu Zhu did not know internal strength. Uncle Wu Zhu was very good and powerful. So Uncle Wu Zhu, he laughed bitterly and said, "Even if Uncle Wu Zhu came from the temple, what about my mother?" "Nonsense. The blind man is an emissary of the temple. Your mother is his mistress. Of course, she is a fairy of the temple. Otherwise, How could she have done so much on her own? Sigu Jian scolded irritably. It was as if he felt that Fan Xian's question was unnecessary. However, Fan Xian did not feel that it was unnecessary. He smiled bitterly and thought that his mother, Yi Qingmei, was clearly like him. She had a soul that did not belong to this world. What relationship could she have with the temple? Fan Xian and Sigu Jian spoke energetically and sighed as they reminisced. Their voices naturally converged and did not affect anyone under the tree. The Northern Qi Emperor stood by the two of them the entire time, quietly listening to all of this. Her face gradually paled as the hands in her sleeves began to tremble. She didn't expect that she would be able to hear such a soul-stirring secret under this tree. She finally understood why a young man like Fan Xian, from the beginning of his time in the world, possessed a confidence and even arrogance that no one else in the world could match. He dared to be so disdainful of an emperor, sit on equal footing with a great grandmaster like Sigu Jian, shamelessly talk about the world, and try to control everything in his hands. The little emperor knew that Fan Xian's mother was Yi Qingmei. She also faintly knew that there was a blind great master behind him. It was not until now that she learned that the young lady of the Yi family and the blind great master had an inexplicable connection to the temple. What was the temple? It was a god that floated above the clouds in the sky, coldly watching the suffering of the mortal world without the slightest change in expression. It was a will that surpassed mortals. It was the legendary protector of the land. However, no one knew where the temple was or what it was, other than Master Ku He, who had seen it with his own eyes. Ku He kowtowed in front of the temple for 3 days and gained the abilities of a great grandmaster. Under the large tree, the young lady of the Yi family met Sigu Jian. Sigu Jian went from being an idiot with a runny nose to a warrior with unparalleled sword skills. Another example was the Qing Emperor. The little emperor's short eyelashes trembled uncontrollably. From the beginning of the Wei Kingdom until now, everyone in the world wanted to see the appearance of the temple with their own eyes. They wanted to find a shadow of the heavenly path in the illusory. Back then, the Wei Emperor had sent out thousands of troops to the north to search for the temple in order to live forever. Behind Fan Xian, there was the shadow of the temple. The Northern Qi Emperor glanced at Fan Xian's silhouette. Her heart was shocked and complicated. Fan Xian took a deep breath and said, "I should know a little about what happened later. After Mother lived in Dongyi for a few years, she began to do business. That created the Yi family, as well as the present Qing palace treasury. No matter how things develop, it is never so simple." Sigu Jian raised his remaining arm and raised a finger. Even if Yi Qingmei was an immortal, she would not have been able to do what she did without any help. She needed someone to help her. Fan Xian furrowed his brows and looked at Sigu Jian. "You? Me?" Sigu Jian said coldly. Sigu Jian coldly said, "Although I am an idiot, I am, after all, the young master of the manor of the master of the city. As long as I control the manor of the master of the city, the Yi family business will be able to do as they please within Dongyi." "I understand." Fan Xian lowered his head. The chance encounter under the tree was not necessarily a chance encounter. To put another way, before she entered Dongyi, she already knew the situation in the city. That is why she chose you. "No, a chance encounter is a chance encounter," Sigu Jian said coldly. Sigu Jian coldly said, "At least, that is what I firmly believe. If she is looking for collaborators, there are many better than me. The things in her head are enough to attract countless riches. The existence of the blind man can ensure that she has no true enemies in this world." "What were you doing in the years before you started your business?" Fan Xian did not argue with this question. "I continued to look at ants and practice my swordplay. One day, Fei Jie, that poisonous old man, came." Sigu Jian yawned. It seemed that the long hours of reminiscing had taken a toll on his mind. "Oh, teacher said that the most glorious thing in his life was turning an idiot in Dongyi into a great grandmaster." Fan Xian smiled. Sigu Jian smiled mockingly and said, "It is just that my mind is easily pedantic." I'm not truly an idiot. What does becoming a great grandmaster have to do with Fei Jie? Fan Xian's eyes and brows held a smile. Naturally, it has to do with my mother. Sigu Jian was silent for a moment and then also smiled. Your mother was able to pass the martial method of Tianyi Dao to Ku He, so she could pass this sword method to me. However, I am a genius. Your mother's sword method was not very useful. What was truly useful was something I comprehended later on. You seem to be more narcissistic than I thought. Fan Xian shrugged. He knew that this great grandmaster was speaking the truth. Even if the Sigu sword method was one of the martial methods Yi Qingmei had stolen from the temple, it was impossible for a mortal to reach the realm of a great grandmaster unless one was a great genius, perseverance, and luck. There are many meanings to a genius. Sigu Jian's eyelids drooped as if they could close at any moment and never open again. Your mother once said that my genius lies in focus and coldness. It is not easy to find someone who can watch ants move for 10 years, Sigu Jian said in a raspy voice. Sigu Jian said in a raspy voice, an idiot who uses thin branches to kill tens of thousands of ants is even harder to find. I was lucky to meet your mother in Wuzhou. Your mother was also lucky to meet me in Dongyi. Fan Xian couldn't speak for a long time. He quietly savored these words. He thought to himself that decades ago, a storm had been brewing on the land. Who knows how many geniuses had appeared? Someone with Ku He's perseverance, Sigu Jian's obsession, and the emperor's endurance. They had all appeared at that time. Then, Yi Qingmei had taken Uncle Wu Zhu and escaped from the temple and met these people. Regardless of realm, luck, talent, and willpower in this world, no one could compare to these warriors who had not yet become great grandmasters. Haitang could not. Haitang could not. Her teacher dared to eat human flesh. Fan Xian could not. His old emperor could endure the unparalleled pain and despair of having his meridian shattered. 13th Wang could not either. His sword saint teacher did not care about human life at all. The young people of this time all had their flaws and inadequacies. This kind of difference would take many years and many setbacks to make up for. Only then would they be able to touch the layer of paper between heaven and man. Finally, they would leap over and become a true great grandmaster. Everything is fate. Fan Xian looked at Sigu Jian and sighed. Sigu Jian looked at Fan Xian with a strange expression and said, "Do you want to learn? If you want to learn, just say it." Fan Xian's heart jumped. He knew what this sword saint was preparing to teach him. A bitter smile rose involuntarily to his face. In a quiet voice, he said, "I think you already know." "I already know." Sigu Jian coldly said, "I am talking about the true Sigu Jian." Fan Xian's heart jumped. He was silent for a long time. Suddenly, he said, "In reality, there is no difference. The important thing is still the people. The young people of my generation still cannot compare to your generation. Of course, this kind of gap may slowly shrink. Even if you moved everything in the temple in front of me, what if I couldn't learn it?" His heart was filled with boundless emotions. It seemed that the martial secrets his mother had stolen from the temple back then had been passed on to these great grandmasters. Apart from Yilia Yun's flowing cloud release hand, the origin of which was a little unclear, the others had already received sufficient proof. Outside the temple, Ku He had paid the price of being heavily injured to save Yi Qingmei, who had only been 4 at the time. Then, he had obtained the price from Yi Qingmei's hands, which was now the supreme technique of Tianyi Dao. Although Sigu Jian's sword technique was something he had comprehended himself with exceptional spiritual energy and stubbornness, it was clear that without the chance encounter under the large tree, an idiot would still be an idiot. If it could not be activated, how could he advance? As for the little yellow booklet that had always followed Fan Xian, the first volume was the tyrannical way, and the second was the kingly way. It had been with him for 20 years. Now, he understood that this was something his mother had left for the emperor. Then, somehow, through Wu Zhu's hands, the emperor had left it for him. It was the tyrannical martial method that made Fan Xian feel a sense of defeat. No matter what, he could not enter the realm of the kingly way. He had also learned Tianyi Dao's Jinshi method, but it did not help him in any way. Even if Sigu Jian truly had the so-called true Sigu Jian to pass on to him, what use would it be? The things Yi Qingmei had left behind in this world had already been gradually picked up by Fan Xian. One more seemed to be of no use. Back in the day, Yi Qingmei grew into a towering tree in Dongyi. I relied on the sword in my hand to obtain a position in Dongyi and become her partner in catching bugs by the side of this large tree, Sigu Jian said quietly with his eyes slightly closed. Sigu Jian closed his eyes slightly. In a quiet voice, he said, "If you can't practice it, then continue to practice. It is not so easy for a tree to grow." Chapter 640. Fan Xian stood under the large tree with one hand on his waist and the other gently patting the tree trunk. His mouth said it was forced, but there was a smile in his eyes. His appearance was as shameless as one could imagine. It was as if his entire body had been marked with many small squares. Each square had a large word written on it. This was the so-called cheap square. This young man from the Qing kingdom, in front of Sigu Jian, not only did his words and actions offend, he even began to be cheap. The Northern Qi emperor, who had been silently listening to their conversation and digesting the shock in her heart, tried to seize an opportunity. Seeing this scene, she could no longer resist. Looking at Fan Xian, she sighed and said, "How can a person be so shameless?" Fan Xian turned his head and glanced at her. With a self-mocking smile, he said, "You should know that I have learned Tianyi Dao. You should also know that I know the tyrannical martial method. If I also learn the Sigu sword, although it is not a burden to have more skills, I always feel that I will become a strange creature. Furthermore, perhaps I will wipe out all possibilities in the future. Most importantly, I have never believed that there is love without reason or hate without reason in this world." He turned towards Sigu Jian in the wheelchair and quietly said, "You still haven't given up on the idea in your heart. Must those old fellows cultivate an opponent for my emperor before they die?" Sigu Jian's expression was cold as he said, "Of the three of you, I didn't think highly of you in the past. Unexpectedly, you've changed a lot in these 2 years. You've improved a lot. It is beyond my expectations." Fan Xian lowered his head slightly and replied, "After experiencing many life and death matters, one will always feel deeply moved." He knew that the three people Sigu Jian was referring to were him, Haitang, and 13th Wang, the three young people most likely to be close to the realm of Great Grandmaster. He thought for a bit and then continued, 13th should have learned it before, but even he could not comprehend its true meaning, much less me. Sigu Jian didn't say anything. On the contrary, it was the Northern Qi Emperor who smiled slightly and said to Fan Xian, "If you really don't want to learn, why don't you give this opportunity to me?" "You?" Fan Xian laughed out loud. "The Emperor is truly someone who does things differently." The little Emperor pressed her thin lips together into a smile and said, "The Sword Saint just wants to make more trouble for the Qing Emperor after he dies. You are, after all, his illegitimate child. I'm afraid you won't be able to harden your heart. Passing it to me seems more direct." Hearing these words, even Sigu Jian couldn't resist laughing hoarsely. Unexpectedly, there are more and more interesting people in the world. All right, let's not talk about other people's business. Fan Xian stood seriously behind Sigu Jian. His hands gently rested on the back of the wheelchair. "Since I want to learn, I have to hurry. Should I go bathe and fast for a few days?" Sigu Jian's expression was strange. Turning his head to glance at him, he said, "Swords are used to kill. Even if you wash for 100 days, in the end, you will still be stained with blood. Why wash?" Fan Xian shook his head and said, "Since you want to teach me, you have to act like a teacher. You should have learned most of the sword techniques from him." Sigu Jian narrowed his eyes slightly and coldly said, "A sword is a dead object. What holds it is the hand. No matter which direction you stab or chop down from, no matter how many changes there are, it is impossible to exceed 10,000. In the end, space is only so big." Fan Xian listened silently and seriously. To the side, the little emperor also closed her eyes tightly, unwilling to let go of a single word of Sigurd. Even if her realm was not enough for her to understand too much, forcefully memorizing it, there were still many talented aces in the northern Qi court, such as Haidang, who was far away on the grasslands. How can a sword stab out and kill someone? This is a problem with sword techniques. There's always a limit to the changes in sword techniques. In tens of thousands of years, who knows how many virtuous people of the past have put in hard work. As the saying goes, there is nothing new under the sun. No matter what kind of change there is, it has long been deduced by others. Thus, the sword technique has never been the most important part. Sigurd's remaining arm rested calmly on the armrest of the wheelchair. He slowly stroked it like he was stroking the hilt of an ancient sword. When you sense a certain realm, you should understand that what you need to consider with a murderous sword is not how to kill, but whether you should kill. It seemed to be a very profound statement, but Fan Xian understood it. Wu Zhu had once talked to Fan Xian about the so-called power. Power was the level of Jinqi cultivation in a person's body, but power contained too many things, such as an aura and specific techniques. Sword techniques, without question, had to be included in power. What Sigurd was talking about now had already surpassed the scope of power. It is the heart and the will. When your power has reached its peak, what you need to break through is the heart and the will, Sigurd said coldly. He then raised his head to gaze at the large tree above his head. In an instant, the sword intent in his eyes pierced the sky. The countless birds and insects in the big green tree sensitively felt the killing intent that filled the heaven and earth. They fled in panic and let out countless bird cries and insect cries. It was extremely mournful. The birds turned into countless black dots and flew out from the deep green canopy, heading straight for the clouds under the sky. They wanted to get as far away from this place as possible. Sigurd's voice grew lower and lower. A person is not a god. His physical body is a vessel. In the end, there is a limit. The cultivation of Jinqi and the increase of the real realm will stop when it reaches a certain stage, a stage where the body and meridians cannot hold it. If one continues to forcefully cultivate and increase it, it will only cause their meridians to break and they will become useless. Of course, rising another foot above the Blue Sea realm is already at the upper 9th level. If one wants to increase it further, it is a very difficult matter. Sigurd's eyes continued to gaze calmly at the green treetop. Fan Xian and the little emperor listened quietly to the side. The atmosphere was slightly strange. The little emperor was not a martial ace, so she did not understand. However, Fan Xian immediately captured the true meaning within. Regardless of whether it was Lang Tiao, Yin Zhilan, or himself, they had all entered the upper 9th level realm. However, they could no longer increase their cultivation because they had already reached the limits of the human body. No matter how much they cultivated, they could only maintain themselves in this realm. Reality is the water in a jar. The power is the way the water is sprinkled, Sigurd said slowly. Sigurd leisurely said, "A jar of water will never be able to nourish 10,000 acres of fertile land. This is the so-called limit. If you cannot break through the boundaries of power, you can forever only sprinkle water one ladle at a time. You cannot change your pettiness. No matter how many sword techniques you learn, there's only so much of the source. Of course, you cannot experience the feeling of a river bursting its banks. Thus, the most important thing is still the Jinqi in the body," Fan Xian unconsciously replied. Fan Xian unconsciously followed up. He thought of the unfathomable way of the emperor's Jinqi in the emperor's body. Between realms, there is always a balance and mutual restriction. Reality is indeed the most important thing. If you cannot grasp a method to release the reality in your body, it is impossible for you to have an extraordinary reality. Just like if a river bursts its banks, if you cannot control the flow of the river water, the mysterious heavens will certainly not grant you a river. Sigurd smiled mockingly. The heavens have the virtue of cherishing life and will not let a person die, so easily. This saying is too idealistic. Furthermore, I have suddenly realized that although you have raised the most warriors in the world, in terms of teaching students, you are actually about the same as Uncle Wu Zhu. Fan Xian sighed. He thought to himself that what Sigu Jian said was very reasonable. It was just nonsense. Without a method to control the Jinqi in the body, the self-restraint of the human body would not allow the Jinqi to expand limitlessly. If one could not increase the Jinqi beyond that critical point, it would be impossible to grasp such a mysterious method. It was truly nonsense. Furthermore, it was a proposition that did not make sense. Because the Jinqi in the body is no longer at a level that the human body can tolerate and has already left the boundaries of the mortal world, the method to control this kind of Jinqi should not be something that humans have. Sigu Jian pulled his gaze back from above and looked at Fan Xian coldly. This is a very natural principle. Then, how do you solve this problem? You must first find a method that does not belong to the mortal world. Perhaps it was because Sigu Jian had pulled his gaze back, but the wind on the tree had stopped. The leaves swayed gently. The young birds and bugs that had not been able to escape the tree in time sank into silence with the joy of escaping death. It is precisely the will and will I spoke of earlier. Sigu Jian looked into Fan Xian's eyes. He didn't know how much this young man could comprehend. Slowly, he said, "Extraordinary strength can only appear in this world through extraordinary methods. You have to forget everything you have ever learned. Little tricks, coffin breaker, Sigu sword, tyrannical methods, Tianyi Dao methods. You have to forget all of these methods that can capture traces. As long as there are traces, there must be a reason to follow. However, the true power of the great Grandmaster realm truly does not have any reason." The pupils in Sigu Jian's eyes gradually constricted. Looking at Fan Xian, he said in a stern voice, "You have to forget that you are a person. You have to forget that you have hands and feet. You have to forget the hair on your body and the soreness in your bones. Don't try to use any methods that your body can control to calm the Jinqi in your body. Only the will can cast aside the restrictions of the physical body." Sigu Jian's voice gradually became lower, but it was like countless bells ringing in Fan Xian's heart. "Take off your clothes." Taking off his clothes, Fan Xian's heart felt like it had been struck by lightning. Sweat suddenly seeped out of his body and completely soaked his clothes. He was familiar with these words because it was a passage from the records of old sayings in the 5 classics. When Master Ku He's teacher, Master Jianshun, was comprehending the way, he had once shouted, "The human body is the undershirt. Only by taking it off is the path of the way." On the precipice in Danzhou, at the most crucial moment of his cultivation of the tyrannical martial method, Uncle Wu Zhu had smashed his staff into his head and also shouted these words. Unexpectedly, he had heard these words again from Sigu Jian's mouth. There seemed to be the will of heaven in the unseen world. It was also proving to Fan Xian the deep meaning of these words. It was as if it was showing him a completely new, mysterious, immeasurable, and charming realm. After this great Grandmaster Sigu Jian finished speaking, he didn't speak again. He sat calmly and silently under the tree. Fan Xian's body was covered in cold sweat. He faintly knew he understood something, but in reality, he didn't understand anything. He knew what Sigu Jian said was true and correct. However, this kind of method was too vague and indiscernible. There was no way to find it. Most importantly, such an idealistic way of speaking was completely different from the tyrannical martial method he had cultivated since he was a child. Without a person as a bridge, could he affect this real world with just his thoughts? What was different about man's existence in the world from all things? It was in the word thoughts. Man was the spirit of all things. He could speak and think. He could watch flowers bloom and feel joy. He could watch flowers fall and feel sorrow. He could watch the full and waning of the moon and feel the eternal vicissitudes of heaven and earth. He could watch the rise and fall of the tides and feel the impermanence of life. The old men with their heads bent in the yellow earth also knew the joy of shadow puppets. It was an instinctive pleasure to follow Pan Lang through the night. It could also affect one's thoughts in a way that left one's instincts or substance. A powerful official with unparalleled evil could sit in seclusion for half a day, write a painting, and be proud of himself for a long time. He was moved to tears. No creature was more complicated than humans. Only humans could have such rich emotions and thoughts that could not be forgotten in a moment. Heaven and earth were indifferent. Spectators lived and died. Only humans could look back at heaven and earth and faintly connect their thoughts. The sweat on Fan Xian's body gradually dried. He knew how admirable that realm was. He also knew that it was not a realm that could be reached just because he wanted to. He asked in a raspy voice, "The true Sigu Jian does not need a sword. How will you teach me? This method cannot be passed on. It's not that I don't want to pass it on. It's that I cannot pass it on." Sigu Jian broke the silence and coldly said, "Today, you will wander with me through Dongi. I can only let you see. As for how much you can experience, it will all depend on your luck." Fan Xian bowed sincerely and said, "I am willing to lead the way for you." The little emperor stood beside the two of them with her eyes closed. Her eyelids trembled anxiously. It looked like she was trying to memorize every word of their conversation. Sigu Jian did not pay attention to what these two young people were thinking. He indicated for Fan Xian to push his wheelchair away from the tree and toward the bustling interior of Dongi. At some point, perhaps it was the moment Sigu Jian raised his head to look at the sky, the people under the tree had long scattered in all directions in fear. It was completely silent under the tree. There was only a faint shadow enveloping the ground under the tree. Chapter 641. When three people walk together, there will always be a teacher. Fan Xian and the little emperor pushed Sigu Jian and quietly left the tree. Following the long, straight path, they entered Dongi's busiest street. The travelers who had been resting under the tree had long scattered in all directions in shock. Slowly, the scene they had seen earlier reached the ears of many people. Not many people had discovered who the cripple sitting on the wheel of the chair was. Sigu Jian was Dongi's god. Not many mortals had seen him before. The pedestrians on the street only felt that the combination of these three people was a little strange. Two very handsome young men were pushing a disabled person in a wheelchair. They didn't look like merchants who were here to buy or sell goods, nor did they look like tourists who came because of the fame. Fan Xian paid no attention to the gazes around him. He just quietly pushed the wheelchair. His gaze naturally fell on Sigu Jian's shoulder. In the back of his head, he carefully thought back to the Grandmaster realm he had felt under the tree earlier. He was a person who loved to learn. When he had escorted Xiao in back to Northern Qi, he had not forgotten to ask Xiao in about court matters. Although there was an unspeakable grudge between him and Sigu Jian, their relationship was incomparably complicated and subtle. Since this great Grandmaster was willing to reveal this realm to him and give him a chance to study it, he would not pass it up. Even though Sigu Jian's action had a dangerous, murderous intent, Fan Xian still did not want to pass it up. Perhaps for just one day in Dongi, he was willing to see Sigu Jian as his true teacher. Of the three of them, only the Northern Qi Emperor's situation was awkward. She seemed to be Sigu Jian's guest, but in reality, she was only a hostage in Fan Xian's hands. At this moment, she was purely a traveling companion. She was unable to understand the silent communication between Sigu Jian and Fan Xian. She could only watch helplessly and say nothing. After leaving the tree, Sigu Jian did not bring up those profound words again. Fan Xian also did not ask him seriously for guidance. It was as if the two of them had forgotten what they had talked about earlier and what they wanted to do. They only quietly and freely strolled through Dongi, walking amidst the gazes and whispers of the people around them. Just as Sigu Jian had said, there were many things that could only be understood and not conveyed. Since it was so, there was no benefit in saying more, so it was better not to say it. After walking for a while, perhaps Fan Xian noticed the little emperor's uneasiness. He glanced at her with a slight smile and quietly said something. A strained smile rose to the little emperor's cold face. Sigujin took the two juniors to some old and rundown buildings. They were the places where the Yi family had made their fortune many years ago. Now, they had long been used for other purposes. The people who lived there would never have thought that the greatest merchant in the world had once lived in these rooms. Fanxian knew what Sigujin wanted to tell him and what he wanted to influence him, but he maintained his silence. It was not until they reached the Yi family's glass workshop that he quietly asked, later on, "You became the protector of Dongyi. Why did Yi Qingmei, my mother, leave with Uncle Wu Zhu?" Fanxian knew that period of history. After Yi Qingmei and Wu Zhu left Dongyi, they did not enter the surrounding vassal states. Instead, they found their way south of Dongyi and north of Danzhou. They found a path between the precipitous cliffs in that wild and primitive forest and went directly to Danzhou. That path was like a sheep's intestines and heavenly stairs. It was difficult to walk, but it was still a path. During the Dong Mountain incident 3 years ago, Yin Xiaoyi had used this path to sneak out and surround Dong Mountain with 5,000 soldiers. After the incident, regardless of whether it was the Qing Kingdom or Dongyi, they all invested boundless enthusiasm and caution into this secret path. Both sides placed heavy troops on both ends of the path. Fanxian did not care about this path. He only cared about why Yi Qingmei had left Dongyi. By the seaside in Danzhou, Yi Qingmei had met the emperor, his father, and that old man, Chun Pingping. From then on, the glorious career of the Qing Kingdom's Gang of Four began. At that time, I had just taken over the city lord's manor. The Sore Hut had just opened. There was an uncontrollable anger in his cold words. Your mother's departure had nothing to do with whether or not I was powerful. It only had to do with whether or not Dongyi was powerful. She was ambitious. The things she wanted to do had to rely on an even more powerful power in order to spread through the world. Sigujin turned his head and glanced at Fanxian. In an icy voice, he said, in her opinion, Dongyi's power was not enough to support her thoughts. Fanxian silently pushed the wheelchair. He understood what was going on. Since Yi Qingmei had chosen to enter the world in Dongyi because she pitied the suffering of the people, this idealistic woman who had once shone with boundless light would certainly think of a way to perfect this matter. Although Dongyi was located by the sea and had gathered all the wealth in the world, it was once a territory of the Wei Kingdom. Its position in the land was not very prominent. Most importantly, the people in Dongyi made their living as merchants. They were more than clever, but they were not very stubborn. If they wanted to create something big and use their own ideals to influence the entire world, Dongyi was, without question, not a good choice. Why didn't she go to Northern Qi? Yes, it was the Wei Kingdom. The Northern Qi Emperor, who had been silent the entire time, suddenly interjected, causing Fanxian and Sigujin to glance at her at the same time. She sighed helplessly and said, I can't be mute all day. The reason the little emperor couldn't resist asking this question was simple. Before hearing today's story, as the emperor of Northern Qi, she already had a deep understanding of the Yi family, once the foremost family in the world. She had a faint sense of admiration for that Yi woman. Later, after she took over the government, she worked hard to collude with the Qing Kingdom's Jiangnan Palace Treasury. She knew just how much influence the palace treasury could have on a country. Thus, she was very regretful and curious as to why Yi Qingmei had not gone to the Wei Kingdom, which was now her own country. If she had gone, perhaps Fanxian would have been born in Shangjing. Perhaps Northern Qi would not be as difficult as it was now. Of course, the biggest possibility was that Fanxian would no longer exist in this world. Fanxian smiled and explained in front of Sigujin. Back then, the Wei Kingdom controlled the entire land. It was the place where the feudal and decadent powers were most concentrated. Although it is said that a revolution should go to the most difficult place, in reality, it is not realistic. At that time, the Qing Kingdom had already been at war with Shihu for many years. The power of the country was beginning to show signs of youth. However, it was only in a corner and did not attract much attention. Additionally, the The Qing people's personalities were open and unyielding, so they were more receptive to new things. Thus, it was not surprising that Mother chose the Qing kingdom. After saying this, the little emperor furrowed her brows and shook her head unhappily. She thought to herself, "What kind of nonsense is this? How come I clearly understand each word, but when put together, I don't know what he is talking about?" Sigu Jian glanced at Fan Xian and said, it was for this reason that she left Dongyi and went to the Qing kingdom. She thought that the heir of the Qing kingdom would obediently listen to her. When the Qing kingdom unified the world, it would be the time she changed the world. Who would have thought that the heir would eventually become a true dragon in the world? How could he tolerate someone riding on his body? In the end, this great grandmaster could not suppress his laughter. There was a hint of joy in his laughter. Fan Xian was slightly angry in his heart. He stared at him coldly. Sigu Jian did not care about his gaze at all. Coldly, he added, "When I was young, I tasted countless joys and sorrows in the human world. I almost lost my life a number of times. Who knows how many of the servants and wet nurses who raised me died. Once I had power in my hands, and my swordsmanship was beginning to form. When I entered the manor of the master of the city, I was determined to kill for revenge. However, I was stopped by your mother. Since your mother has left Dongyi and gone to the Qing kingdom, I can kill as I please." Sigu Jian lowered his head slightly. "In one night, I massacred over 100 people in the manor. In one night, my aura was in chaos, and my realm began to form. Of course, after that matter, your mother and I broke off any correspondence. From then on, we were strangers." Sigu Jian gently patted the armrest of the wheelchair. His words were filled with sorrow, hatred, and sharpness. Fan Xian mockingly said, "Don't tell me that things are still so common. Don't tell me you are also one of my mother's admirers?" Sigu Jian mockingly said, "No matter how beautiful she was or how capable she was in my eyes, she was still that little girl under the tree. I have no interest in strange things. In this life, I only love the sword in my hand." Fan Xian could clearly feel the long-suppressed resentment in Sigu Jian's chest. Perhaps it was a sense of loneliness after being abandoned. Perhaps it was because this great grandmaster saw Yi Qingmei's heart-wrenching end, but was powerless to change anything. Sigu Jian had gone to the Qing royal palace 3 times with the intention of assassinating the Qing emperor. Because of the grandmaster ace who never appeared in the royal palace, he had returned. He could not use his life as a gambling stake. His life represented the countless lives in Dongyi. Yet, he still went to the Qing kingdom. Just this proved his power. Why did Sigu Jian want to assassinate the Qing emperor? In the past, perhaps people thought that under the threat of the Qing kingdom, Dongyi was like a bird's nest in a storm and could be destroyed at any moment. Thus, this great grandmaster who used the sword tried to use his powerful martial power to change the course of history. After hearing so many stories and seeing so many of the marks Yi Qingmei had left in Dongyi, a different thought suddenly welled up in Fan Xian's heart. Perhaps Sigu Jian wanted to assassinate the Qing emperor because he was angry at the Qing emperor for not protecting Yi Qingmei. The 3 of them gradually became silent again. It was impossible for Fan Xian to express his gratitude to Sigu Jian for assassinating the emperor. The little emperor also could not say to himself that he had a good time today. Sigu Jian's expression also became stern. It was hard to tell whether he was happy or angry. The 2 of them didn't disturb him. The wheelchair rolled along the streets of Dongyi. The creaking was crisp and clear. It was as if it could travel along the long streets all the way to the harbor at the end. It could even travel to the ships and then be taken to other unfamiliar places in this world. Fan Xian suddenly raised his head. A clear light appeared in his eyes as he scanned his surroundings. What startled him from his thoughts was the clear and terrifying creaking sound beneath him. It was daytime. In his observations 2 days ago, it should be the busiest time in Dongyi. Merchants selling goods, travelers from afar, and sightseeing guests would all crowd here and make a racket. Why was it so quiet now? Even the creaking of the wheelchair could travel so far. He looked at the scene in front of him and took a deep breath. His face was slightly pale. His heart was filled with shock. The expression of the Northern Qi Emperor, who was pushing the wheelchair beside him, also changed slightly. Although she had seen such a scene countless times in her life, suddenly seeing it today still made her feel indescribably shocked. There was not a single person on the street. There wasn't even a scrap of paper. There were only green stone slabs pieced together into the distance. All of the merchants and travelers were squeezed under the eaves on the two sides of the street. They knelt on the ground and bowed toward the center of the clean street, not moving at all. The little emperor knew that these foreign people were not bowing to her. They could only be bowing to the great grandmaster in the wheelchair. She couldn't resist looking at Sigu Jian's shoulder with a questioning gaze. Only now did she know that Sigu Jian's position in the hearts of the Dongi people was even higher than that of an emperor. There were no soldiers to suppress them or open up a path. Everyone prostrated to the ground and bowed towards Sigu Jian in the wheelchair. It was like they were looking at the god in their hearts as they slowly walked toward the end of the street. Everyone in the world knew that this great grandmaster was about to die. Not many people in Dongi had seen this great grandmaster's true face. During these 2 years, they still couldn't help but feel terrified and uneasy, particularly now that they had truly seen the great grandmaster in the wheelchair. Endless sorrow grew in the hearts of the Dongi people. They knew that it was this crippled person in the wheelchair who had used the sword in his hand to protect their wealth, their freedom, and the decades of peace in their homes. A sense of shame even grew in their hearts. They felt that it was shameful to live under the protection of the Sword Saint for so many years. The Sword Saint was tired and old. A god gradually grew old and would eventually die. Just like the sun across the street, there would be a moment when it would sink into endless darkness. It looked like the moment under the tree had finally spread and startled all of the people in Dongi. They knew that the Sword Saint had finally come out of the hut and had come among them. That was why they were prostrating on the ground and feeling sorrow in their hearts. They were making this final farewell to express their gratitude. Fan Xian looked at this scene and felt a strange doubt in his heart. How did these people know that the person in the wheelchair was Sigu Jian? There was no time to think. He had already sensed the powerful aura emanating from Sigu Jian's small body. It was an aura that pushed people thousands of li away. It was an aura of absolute coldness. It was a completely different aura from the tens of thousands of people prostrating on the sides of the long street. Fan Xian was silent. He knew that this great grandmaster was giving him a second lesson. He didn't use words, only his actions. He used the shocking and sorrowful scene on the long street to tell him that in order to enter the realm of a great grandmaster, he not only had to take off his clothes, but he also had to abandon his emotions. It was not that he was heartless. Sigu Jian's feelings for this large city were probably already very deep, which was why he appeared so cold and heartless. He was somewhat dismissive of the emotions the people of the secular world poured into him. Emotions are very precious things, but they're also very cheap things, Sigu Jian said for the first time on the long street. These were Sigu Jian's first words on the long street. If you have feelings for something, then you cannot be controlled by this feeling. And this is your mother's biggest problem. Fan Xian and the little emperor were deep in thought as they pushed the wheelchair forward under the worshipful gazes of tens of thousands of people. The creaking of the wheelchair grew louder and more ear-piercing. Then the wheelchair stopped in front of a beautiful building. It was the manor of the master of the city that Fan Xian had come to yesterday. "What are we doing here?" Fan Xian asked respectfully. Chapter 642. I don't know why, but I felt very tired these past few days. I wanted to sleep every day. Is this the legendary autumn sleepiness? If everyone thinks this chapter is passable, throw in 2 monthly votes and praise it. I still want to keep up with the large group of monthly votes. Many thanks, many thanks. After the wheelchair entered the manor of the master of the city, the street outside remained absolutely silent. Although the people of Dongi straightened their bodies from under the eaves, no one left. No one discussed. They only looked fearfully and uneasily in the direction of the manor of the master of the city. Countless gazes were focused in that direction. They didn't know what was happening inside, or why the Sword Saint had come alone to the manor of the master of the city. It was to kill. Regardless of whether Sigurd, the great grandmaster, decided to tie Dongi to someone's carriage or step onto someone's road before he died, whether it was north or south, it was all his decision. All of Dongi, including the surrounding vassal states that had submitted, had to follow his will. Although this great grandmaster was about to leave, he still would not allow anyone in his domain to secretly have disloyal thoughts and collude with the disciples of the hut. Before he made his own decision, they would arrogantly make a decision for him, deciding the direction of Dongi and the life and death of countless people in the city. This was within the scope of a god's work. No mortal could interfere, not even the eldest disciple of the sword hut or the manor of the master of the city, who maintained daily order in Dongi. The master of the city was the last distant relative Sigurd could find in a remote and desolate place after he had massacred his clan. Those who went against him would die without a doubt. This was the so-called will of a grandmaster. This did not need to be emphasized. It was just a natural bottom-line principle. It was only for Fan Xian to see it more clearly that Sigurd had brought him here. After the little emperor stepped into the manor of the master of the city, her face became very pale. It was as if she was about to become transparent. There was a sense of loss and shock that could not be erased in her eyes. She knew what Sigurd wanted to do. Other than Yun Jilan, Northern Qi's greatest support in Dongi was the people in the manor of the master of the city. The little emperor had been hoping that these two powers could help her convince Sigurd and have Dongi leave the Qing kingdom's control. If Sigurd was going to wash the manor in blood, it showed his attitude. The little emperor felt slightly dizzy. Tightly biting her lower lip, she stood silently behind the wheelchair. Fan Xian glanced at her calmly. Seeing the paleness of her face, his heart jumped slightly. He reached out and patted her shoulder to express his comfort. This was not the consolation of a victor to a loser. It was just that his heart had been pierced by the sword intent of the expert in the wheelchair, causing his eyes to blink uncontrollably. After Sigurd entered the manor, the emotion in his eyes gradually became indifferent. There wasn't even a glimmer of coldness. Several people knelt down at the stone steps of the second gate of the city lord's mansion and welcomed the arrival of the sword saint in fear and trepidation. They lowered their heads and kowtowed. With this kowtow, their heads were like fruits ripening in autumn. Breaking their branches, they fell and rolled on the ground. There was an extremely smooth cut on their necks, as if they had been cut by an unparalleled sharp sword. Sigurd in the wheelchair, did not have a sword in his hand. The little emperor stared at the rolling heads on the ground. Her face grew paler and paler. Even her tightly pressed lips became whiter. Fan Xian's hand tightened slightly as he held onto the wheelchair. The veins on it were faintly visible. A drop of cold sweat dripped down from his forehead. He knew Sigurd had come to kill and teach him how to kill. He had not thought that this great grandmaster would only need to think for a few lives to cease to exist in this world. The heads rolled to the side, drawing out a streak of blood. They crashed into the moss in the corner of the wall and stopped. Fan Xian's lips were a little dry. He unconsciously wanted to stop Sigurd following actions. He tightened his hand, intending to stop the wheelchair at the bottom of the stone steps. If the manor of the master of the city was massacred, it would make the agreement between the Qing kingdom and Dongi without any power to oppose it. Even the disciples of the sword hut who did not agree with Sigurd will would, because of the blood, once again experience the ruthlessness and power of their sword saint teacher. Fan Xian still did not want to use such a method. He was not a sentimental and pedantic person. However, he thought that the manor of the master of the city would never be a major obstacle. As long as Sigurd nodded, there were many ways to resolve the problem here. He had not thought that Sigurd would use the simplest and crudest method to resolve it. At some point, the wheelchair had already climbed up the stone steps and was moving toward the depths of the manor. Fan Xian and the little emperor's hands were still on the wheelchair. Their hands trembled more and more. Their faces grew paler and paler. They saw more and more blood and more corpses on either side of the wheelchair. Someone finally summoned the courage to pull out a knife. The knife broke in two. Someone screamed and flew away, their waist broken in two. Even more people looked with terrified eyes at the killing god in the wheelchair. Their legs trembled. They could not move at all. They thought of the legend from many years ago. On that night, the great grandmaster in the wheelchair held a sword and entered the manor of the master of the city. The next day, not a single living person could be found in the manor. After many years, Sigu Jian entered the manor again. This time, he did not have a sword in his hand. The entire manor was still sadly enveloped by a thick stench of blood. Fan Xian's face grew paler and paler. The tyrannical Jinshi in his body had been raised to the limit. The moment it left his body, it was crushed into threads by the killing aura that filled the world outside. It broke into pieces and dissipated in an instant. It was impossible to gather the qi. The little emperor's body trembled. She was unable to move at all. She had to place her hand on the wheelchair to barely stabilize her body. Even though she was a powerful female emperor, looking at the countless heads and broken corpses flying through the air, it was still difficult for her to resist the onslaught of this bloody, killing aura. Blood flew. Blood continued to fly. Blood continued to fly. Sigu Jian's face was even paler than these two young men's faces. It was a completely illogical white. It was as if all the blood in his body had flowed to some place and then dispersed into a sword qi that pierced the heavens and slaughtered the earth, and a murderous aura that could destroy the heavens and destroy the earth. It was being released freely. Fan Xian and the little emperor's bodies seemed to have left the control of their minds. They followed this life-taking wheelchair with great passivity as they walked through the manor. The powerful aura emanating from Sigu Jian's body completely controlled all the minute movements around them. The little emperor was powerless to resist, so her reaction was slightly weaker. Fan Xian forcefully focused his mind, wanting to resist this cold, murderous intent that made him feel very uncomfortable and even disgusting. It was as if he was being hammered endlessly by a heavy hammer, shaking his heart and soul with each blow. A thread of blood seeped out from the corner of his lips. A helpless sorrow flashed through his eyes. He lowered his eyelids slightly, no longer looking at everything that was happening in the manor. He gave up on the thought of stopping Sigu Jian from killing. He didn't have this power. He also didn't want to take pity on the innocent servants in the manor and anger a great grandmaster who had already sunk into a crazed state and sink himself into endless danger. His eyelids were slightly lowered. He didn't look, but that didn't mean he didn't know, particularly since this was the last lesson Sigu Jian was giving him. Fan Xian had already relaxed his mind and was no longer fighting head-on against the sword intent that filled the manor. Thus, he could more and more clearly sense any slight change in aura present. He had a deeper understanding of the aura emanating from the great grandmaster's body in the wheelchair. This aura caused him to frown because he detested this aura. Not only did this aura reek of blood, but it was also devoid of emotions. There was only indifference, a kind of indifference that came from looking down on others. It was an indifference that came from looking down on all living things. It was as if in front of Sigu Jian's eyes and thoughts, there was nothing in the world worthy of being treasured. Everyone could be treated like pigs or dogs. However, Fan Xian didn't understand. This great grandmaster clearly had great affection for Donnie. Immediately after, Fan Xian sensed the other realm that the aura represented. It was willpower. Sigu Jian's willpower had already controlled everything around the wheelchair. It was valiant, decisive, and unyielding. All morals, standards, the benevolence of heaven and earth, and the thoughts of the young man behind him became bubbles and floated away in all directions in front of this powerful and absolute willpower. Fan Xian abruptly raised his head. With one hand, he supported the little emperor who was already tottering under this pressure. His eyes quietly followed Sigu Jian's gaze and looked into the manor. He experienced this realm, but he unconsciously feared it. There were no great grandmasters in the world. The reason the four strange creatures were able to break through the limits of humans and move freely between heaven and earth was because of their own understanding of heaven and earth. Their own experiences created the four great grandmasters completely different paths of breakthrough. The Qing Emperor had broken into the realm of a great grandmaster. It was clear that he had taken a very practical path. A cripple with all the meridians in his body shattered had reached a realm of joy. Without the limits of meridians, the power in his body had increased without limit. Using the most difficult method, he had broken through the limits that heaven had created for the human body. Without question, this was the most valiant method. No matter what, Fan Xian did not dare to learn it. He had no way to learn it. Sigu Jian's path was different. Since his youth, there had been too much gloom, too much suppression, and too much impulse to kill. Finally, after one night of massacring his entire clan, he had condensed a powerful state of mind from the stench of blood. In the instant he had severed his emotions and nature, he had finally comprehended a will that would not be moved by external things. Using killing and coldness, he began to look coldly at the line in the sky and easily tear it apart. On the last stone step, in the manner of the master of the city, stood a row of people. The master of Dongyi wore a magnificent clan uniform. His face was deathly pale. He stood in a line with the people closest to him, waiting for the arrival of the Sword Saint. He had gathered his most powerful strength here, but he also knew that it was impossible to stop a great grandmaster from killing people. Fan Xian's hand was on the back of the wheelchair. He did not notice the silence on the stone steps. The wretched cries gradually stopped. He had only sunk into a dazed state. He had finally experienced Sigu Jian's great grandmaster realm. He discovered that the method to search for this realm was perhaps something he would never be able to do. Every blade of grass, stone, flower, and tree in the world had its own reason for surviving. Each person was unique. If one wanted to break through the realm and touch the great grandmaster realm, they would probably have to find a method that truly belonged to them. In the wheelchair, Sigu Jian suddenly began to cough. He coughed until his small body bounced on the wheelchair. He coughed until Fan Xian's hand, which was holding the wheelchair, began to tremble again. The row of aces from a manor of the master of the city on the stone steps saw this scene. They turned into black shadows that filled the sky and split into 7 directions. Like eagles swooping to kill, they leapt toward the wheelchair. The coughing seemed to be an opportunity and a secret signal. The aces from the manor of the master of the city did not hesitate and attacked explosively. However, there was no joy in their hearts. The people of Dongyi, including the aces who practiced swordsmanship by the seaside, were all used to the undefeatable Sword Saint. After decades of divine light, no one had the extravagant hope that they could become the person who killed a god. However, they still had to carry out the final attack. After all, the Sword Saint had coughed. Perhaps it was an opportunity. Perhaps it was not. Since they were going to die under the hands of a great grandmaster should be a kind of glory. Before the shadows arrived, a gust of wind had already hit them in the face. The aces from the manor of the master of the city did not target the 2 young people behind the wheelchair. They had long seen that these 2 young people had already sunk into a mental predicament that they could not extricate themselves from. Fan Xian had a feeling that if he was faced with these aces' most heroic attack before death, he would probably have no way to counterattack. Sigu Jian was still curled up in the wheelchair coughing. His remaining hand covered his mouth. There was no sword by his side. Therefore, he waved his hand, and a sword on the ground moved. It moved extremely quickly, like a bolt of lightning, and arrived in his steady palm. Sigu Jian swung his sword. The power of the sword was not perfect. It was like 7 green mountain peaks suddenly tearing off the outer bark of the tree to reveal the strange, craggy, and thorn-like rocks underneath. It was as if they were going to pierce 7 large holes in the sky. Faced with the last 7 aces from the manor of the master of the city, Sigu Jian casually stabbed out with his sword. With a valiant, indifferent, and bloodthirsty willpower, He stabbed out 4 times in 7 different directions. This was already a strike that surpassed the secular world. It contained an aura that focused only on the front and not on the back. Hidden behind the aura was a supreme willpower that transcended the aura. It was free because of its coldness and indifference because of its bloodthirst. The 4 swords stabbed into 7 people. The 7 aces collapsed to the ground without a sound. Sigurd Jin waved his sleeve. The common steel sword in his hand left his hand and pierced straight into the chest of the master of Dongi. After Sigurd Jin entered the manor in a wheelchair, the master of Dongi did not make a single argument or sigh. He only calmly watched the scene in front of him and waited for death to come. He knew that since his distant uncle had personally come out of the hut, then only death awaited him. Toward a crazy great-grandmaster, a bloodthirsty sword saint, and a heartless monster who had slaughtered his entire clan, the master of the city had no emotion. The master of the city coughed up blood. Feeling his life leave him, he began to cry. In the moment before his death, perhaps there was too much dissatisfaction and resentment in his heart, just like the resentment the Qing Emperor had felt many years ago. There should not have been these great grandmasters in this world. There was too much logic in this world. Fan Xian had watched Sigurd Jin attack seriously. This was the first time Sigurd Jin had truly attacked since entering the manor. He had a sword in his hand. His gaze was very sharp. He had captured the method and trajectory of the last 4 swords. Thus, his heart was incomparably shocked. This was the true Sigurd sword. Like a bird in the sky, like a fish in the water, between one movement and one stillness, there was no warning at all. He only attacked based on his heart. It was not just a valiant act of looking ahead and not caring about the back, looking left and not caring about the right. The 4 swords were elegant and cold to the extreme. One glance could topple a city, the second glance could topple a country, and the third glance troubled the plans of the world. It made a hero cry. Pulling out his sword, Sigurd Jin's heart was at a loss. He did not see the ancients before or after. He watched the long passage of heaven and earth and cried alone. In Suzhou, Yi Luyan had once split half a building with one strike. Fan Xian had thought that the pinnacle of sword skill in the world was nothing more than this. Seeing Sigurd Jin attack, only now did he know that the most powerful symbol of a killing weapon like the sword was the connection between the sword and the heart. There was no faster method of expression in the world than the heart. Where the heart was, the tip of the sword was. To be able to cultivate a sword technique that defied the common sense of heaven and earth and should not exist in this world, even the person controlling the sword would feel a glimmer of awe. Even the person controlling the sword probably didn't know how he was able to use such a sword technique. After one strike, the swordsman held the blood-dripping sword in his hand and looked around at the boundless wilderness with a sense of loss. The true meaning of the Sigurd sword, in the end, was still a sense of loss. Fan Xian's hand continued to hold the little emperor's arm, but he couldn't stop it from trembling. To be able to comprehend such a sword technique, what a fortunate or painful thing it was. On an unknown tree by the master of the city's manor, a crow that had been curled up and peeping for half a day, finally could no longer withstand the will that filled heaven and earth. With a caw, it flew away. Sigurd Jin's eyes were cold. He coughed up blood at the corner of his mouth. His face was terrifyingly pale. His small and thin body was completely curled up in the wheelchair. Of the 2 young people behind him, one was at a loss and the other was stern. Beside them were pools of blood and corpses. Fan Xian lowered his head. A strange thought surged in his heart. He seemed to be able to sense that the great grandmaster in the wheelchair had reached the end of his life. In the end, he had still pulled out his sword. Although these 4 strikes were beautiful and cruel compared to 3 years ago on Dong Mountain, when Sigurd Jin had killed 100 tiger guards with one strike, the Sigurd Jin now was clearly much weaker. The body of the master of Dongyi slowly knelt down in front of the wheelchair. It was as if he was expressing his final submission. Fan Xian abruptly raised his head and watched in shock as a black-clothed man appeared in front of the 3 of them as the master of the city's body fell. Chapter 643. The black-clothed man was the shadow. Of course, he was the shadow. He and Fancian quietly entered Dongi. After arranging everything with the subordinates of the Overwatch Council, they disappeared. When Fancian charged into the sword hut, he was not there. Fancian knew what the head of the 6th Bureau of the Overwatch Council would do once he saw Sigurd. Suddenly, the shadow appeared in the manor behind the body of the master of the city. Sigurd had massacred the manor again. No one knew how many people he had killed, regardless of whether they were alive or dead. As long as his physical body existed, there would always be a shadow under the sunlight. The shadow was hidden in these shadows. To be able to hide from a great grandmaster's perception, suddenly appear in front of the three of them, and capture Sigurd's weakest moment, the shadow was the most powerful assassin in the world. Without question, the cultivation of shadow, the most powerful assassin in the world, had risen to the pinnacle of his life. Sigurd coughed up blood on the wheelchair. His entire body trembled. His body shrunk slightly, and his face was pale. Killing 7 people with one strike made the great grandmaster, who had forcefully dragged it on for nearly 3 years after being heavily injured, feel a glimmer of fatigue. What consumed the most of his energy was Fancian's hands, which were imbued with tyrannical jinshi on the back of the wheelchair. From a moment he stepped into the manor. Fancian's intentions were in opposition to Sigurd's. Sigurd forcefully released his power and forcefully suppressed the will in Fancian's heart. However, Fancian was, after all, a 9th-level ace. Other than killing people, Sigurd still had to focus his thoughts on him and control his mind. It took too much time, so he couldn't help but feel a bit weak. Most importantly, it was the injury he had received on Dong Mountain 3 years ago. Yuyun's claw had stretched out like a dragon in the clouds, and the Qing Emperor's earth-shattering way of the Emperor's killing fist had heavily injured Sigurd, a great grandmaster, to the point that he was on the verge of death. The shadow had chosen this moment to strike. He had chosen the most decisive moment. In his hand was an ancient sword that was as cold as autumn water. In an instant, the light of the sword lit up the entire manor. In the next moment, the stone steps seemed to become as sparkling and translucent as jade. The shadow's toes stepped on these jade-like stone steps. With each step, he seemed to become a little brighter. Occasionally, a few green leaves would fly up at this time, accompanying the autumn wind and rain sword in his hand, adding a bit of sternness. Kill! The ancient sword in the shadow's hand pierced toward Sigurd's chest. This strike was extremely simple. There were no changes, no accumulation of power, and not even the slightest tremble. In the process of the high-speed thrust, the bright sword body was calm like autumn water, stabbing forward smoothly. It was just a bend of the elbow, a flat wrist, and a thrust. It was the simplest sword move in the world. Because it was simple, it was focused and powerful. The shadow did not need to accumulate power, because he had been waiting for this sword for more than 20 years. He had been accumulating power for more than 20 years. It was too fast. When Qingqing's leaves floated up, she was stunned to find that she had fallen behind the black-clothed man. It was so fast that the air in the manor didn't even have time to change after the ancient sword sliced through its body. It let out a whistling wind. Because it was fast, the surrounding environment didn't have time to change. The courtyard was still silent. The only thing that changed was the position of the shadow, the tip of his feet stepping on the jade steps, the light on his body, and the brightest sword at the front of the light. The tip of the sword was only a foot away from Sigurd's chest. A thunderous strike. In such a short amount of time, Fancian only had time to narrow his eyes a little. He recognized the sword in the shadow's hand. When he had tried to assassinate the emperor in the Hanging Temple, the shadow had held this sword in his hand. Fancian even felt a sense of familiarity with the shadow's thunderous strike. Outside the Hanging Temple, under the tall building and against the golden chrysanthemums that covered the mountains and plains, the shadow had once jumped out of the sun in a white robe and pierced straight toward the emperor's face. That day, the shadow had been dressed in white like an immortal from the heavens. He had shone brilliantly. With the plain ancient sword in his hand, he had floated down. Now, the shadow was dressed in black and still held that plain ancient sword. The light on his body still shone wantonly, but it carried a coldness that came from the deepest depths of the earth. It was like a resentful spirit that had been imprisoned for tens of thousands of years and wanted to use this sword to release all of its resentment. Fan Xian's hand continued to hold the little emperor's waist. His pupils constricted slightly, but his body didn't have time to move. His heart was filled with shock. Stepping on the stone steps and crossing the green leaf, how unstoppable was this sword strike? How fast was it? It was so fast that even he couldn't react to it at all. It had even faintly broken through the limits of time. The shadow was the most powerful assassin in the world. He was the closest protector of the Overwatch Council's first and last masters in the night. After he escaped Dongyi, he had always been immersed in darkness and had never walked under the sun. Even when he was assassinating the emperor in the Hanging Temple, that seemingly brilliant strike actually contained care and caution. If the strike didn't hit, he would immediately retreat. And today's shadow was completely different from the shadow of the past. His entire being seemed to be immersed in darkness and negative emotions. But this sword strike was extremely open and above board. His decades of cultivation were all condensed into this sword strike. He didn't leave himself any path of retreat, any path of retreat. He only wanted to advance. With boundless courage and determination, he chose to advance. He only wanted to send this sword into Sigu Jian's chest. At this moment, the shadow was no longer an assassin. He was a swordsman, a vengeful swordsman, a swordsman worthy of respect and admiration. The thunderous strike was softer than the wind, more traceless and faster. It was more dazzling and shocking than lightning. This was the most powerful strike the shadow could demonstrate. Regardless of whether it was Fan Xian, Haitang, or anyone else, sitting in a wheelchair and suddenly facing this strike, they would probably not be able to escape. This was the first strike the shadow had truly struck out in 20 years. It was a strike that had been tempered countless times with a river of time, resentment, and netherworld emotions. In a final moment, the tip of the sword broke through the air. It faintly reached another level. Just like what Sigu Jian had taught Fan Xian earlier, it could only be like this when one's heart was connected. Nothing was faster than a person's heart. No one's heart was more determined, darker, and brighter than the shadows. The darkness was in hatred and complicated emotions. The brightness was in a determination to disregard everything. The muscles all over Fan Xian's body tightened. The tyrannical Jinshi in his body circulated quickly. As soon as his heart reacted, he was going to take the little emperor and escape this place. In front of such a strike, he had no time to react. Sigu Jian could do it. Although he was already at the end of his life, had been heavily injured for 3 years, and had slaughtered the manor of the master of the city and used up a great deal of his energy, he was still a great grandmaster who could not be judged by common sense. However, Sigu Jian's expression was not the same as it had ever been. His face was extremely pale, and his eyes were extremely bright. The right half of his face that had been shattered was like an ugly and terrifying god, emitting an awe-inspiring might. Even a great grandmaster would not underestimate such a strike. However, it was difficult for a great grandmaster to move. He only had one hand left. It seemed that the only thing he could move was this hand. Thus, Sigu Jian moved. Raising his left arm, he spread out his index and middle fingers 4 inches in front of his chest and pressed them together. He used 2 fingers to clamp down on the thunderous strike. His face became even paler. His eyes became even brighter, and his expression became even more solemn. The strike between his 2 fingers was still advancing. The shadow was like Sigu Jian's shadow. Sticking closely to the wheelchair, he let out a wild cry. Like he was crazy, crying, complaining, happy, and angry, he stepped on the path of escape 20 years ago. Holding the pain of his entire clan dying, his parents dying with him, he ruthlessly stabbed down. With a pop, the ancient sword, as cold as autumn water, rubbed against Sigu Jian's protruding knuckles, and made a squeaking sound. It carried a heart-palpitating charred smell as it forcefully broke through Sigu Jian's finger sword and pierced into Sigu Jian's chest. The tip of the sword only entered 2 inches into the great Grandmaster's body before it could move no further. Sigu Jian's eyes were already extremely bright. They were like 2 stars giving off light as they landed on the Shadow's equally pale face. His fingers were like 2 large mountains holding the Shadow's thunderous strike between the mountain rocks, unable to advance another inch. There was a moment of pause. The pale-faced Fan Xian gave a muffled grunt. Grabbing the waist of the little emperor beside him, he flew up diagonally like a large bird. Breaking away from the back of the wheelchair, he sliced through the air and floated toward the tree beside the manor. If he had remained behind the wheelchair, perhaps he would only be injured. The little emperor would certainly die from having her meridians severed under Sigu Jian and the Shadow's double attack. Floating toward the tree, Fan Xian forcefully turned his head in the air with a pale face. He then saw a scene that he would never forget. Sigu Jian's face was very pale. The Shadow's face was also very pale. These 2 brothers had not seen each other since that rainy night in Dongyi. Now, they were tightly pressed together. Their cold faces reflected each other. It was not interesting. It only chilled one's heart. Their bodies were very close to each other. There was only a sword between them. On Sigu Jian's chest, the tip of the sword brought out a spray of fresh blood as it stubbornly tried to burrow in. It was like this great Grandmaster did not feel anything at all. He only looked at the Shadow with his bright and somewhat terrifying old eyes. The 2 fingers of his left hand held the sword steadily and terrifyingly. Will thoughts just a glance. In an instant, the air in the courtyard of the city lord's mansion suddenly changed. It was as if countless wind blades had appeared out of nowhere, slicing through the air and emitting a chi-chi sound. They came from all directions, following a strange trajectory that could not be seen by the naked eye, and slashed towards the center of the city. They sliced toward the Shadow's body. The Shadow was still wearing the special robes of the Overwatch Council. This kind of clothing was a product the Third Bureau had developed for many years. Under the attack of the sword chi that filled the sky, it could only resist for a moment before it began to break apart weakly. Small holes opened up. The material of the clothing opened up like a baby's mouth. Countless holes appeared on the Shadow's body in an instant. Blood began to seep out. Sigu Jian's true counterattack was not outside his body. Rather, it was inside the Shadow's body. That powerful, cold, and bloodthirsty sword intent followed this finger and glance and mercilessly entered the Shadow's body, causing his internal organs to tremble at the same time. Fresh blood seeped out of his body and flowed out along his lips. On the Shadow's pale face, blood flowed endlessly from his lips. It flowed and did not flow. It was as if there would never be a moment to stop. However, the Shadow did not show a glimmer of fear. On the contrary, he smiled. A trace of a bitter smile rose to his pale and ordinary face. His laughter rang through the surroundings of the manor. There was a crazed sobbing in his laughter. The Shadow howled crazily like a wild beast crying in pain. He sent all the Jinqi in his body into the sword in his hand. He did not care all about the pain on his skin. He only cared about the distance between the tip of the sword and Sigu Jian's heart. A powerful wave of qi exploded between the 2 of them, shattering the leaves around the wheelchair into threads and turning them into nothing. In the end, the wheelchair was not a person's legs. Following the Shadow's complete outburst, the wheelchair quickly retreated faster and faster. The sword between Sigu Jian's fingers was also moving at a very slow speed toward his body. Sigu Jian's face grew paler and paler, and his eyes grew brighter and brighter. The Shadow's face also grew paler and paler. Fresh blood flowed from his lips faster and faster. A bloody path appeared on the ground. What Fan Xian saw was this scene. 2 pale people, one vomiting blood and the other silent, were carrying out the craziest and calmest killing. His hand involuntarily began to tremble. He didn't like Sigu Jian. Naturally, he should help the Shadow. However, if he wanted to attack, he would have already done so when he was behind Sigu Jian. Given Sigu Jian's crippled body, if Fan Xian and the Shadow, two powerful warriors, attacked at the same time, there was a chance of success. The Shadow would not be as bitter, sorrowful, or painful as he was now. However, Fan Xian still did not attack. He only trembled and coldly watched this scene. This had nothing to do with the agreement between the Qing Kingdom and Dongyi. It had nothing to do with Sigu Jian's past friendship with his mother, Uncle Wu Zhu, and Sir Fei Jia. He had agreed to create an opportunity for the Shadow to take revenge, but he would not participate in the process of the Shadow's revenge. Although he didn't know what kind of past stories and secrets were behind the massacre of the master of Dongyi's manor, he respected the Shadow. The Shadow was a proud swordsman. At least today, he was not facing his elder brother as an assassin. The pride of Dongyi was the eternal fear and pain in the Shadow's heart. If Fan Xian attacked now, the Shadow would not agree. Fan Xian understood this, so he chose to watch from the side, trembling as he watched. With a clatter, the wheelchair finally retreated to the back of the courtyard. Under the stone steps on the other side, there was no way back. With such a high-speed collision, the wheelchair immediately broke into countless wooden shards. Covered in blood, the madness in the Shadow's eyes flared. Finally, he pushed the sword in his hand forward another inch. For this inch of distance, the Shadow had paid a great price. Sigu Jian's lips trembled. He laughed in a strange and raspy voice. Amidst the laughter, he, who had fallen to the bottom of the stone steps, exerted strength in his fingers. The sword stuck in his chest broke with a crack. The Shadow did not laugh. The tip of the sword broke in Sigu Jian's chest. He still held the broken half of the sword in his hand. It seemed that his momentum did not stop for a moment. The broken half of the sword followed the trembling tip of the sword in Sigu Jian's chest and stabbed down again, piercing deeply into Sigu Jian's chest. From appearing behind the master of the city's body to stepping down the steps, stabbing into Sigu Jian's chest, retreating 30 meters toward the wheelchair, and finally stabbing down with the broken sword, the Shadow's glowing thunderous strike was actually only one strike. It did not break. The unbroken sword intent continued to this day. It was the only strike. In this life, the Shadow would only have one chance to use such a strike. The broken sword, which was not sharp, pierced into Sigu Jian's chest. It was not smooth. On the contrary, there was an astringent feeling. It was as if it was cutting through flesh. It was very painful, very painful. The Shadow seemed to be able to feel the other party's pain because he himself was also in pain. His entire body trembled in pain. He lowered his head and silently stabbed and cut, severing the past from more than 20 years ago. At this moment, the Shadow seemed to see many things. He saw that many years ago, that idiotic older brother of his had secretly built a small grass hut on a piece of wasteland on the outskirts of the city. Then, he had proudly said that this place would be the holy land of martial arts in the future. He was still a child and looked disdainfully at the broken-down grass hut. He watched the blind man and woman who occasionally entered the grass hut. One day, the child became interested in the sword. His idiot brother asked seriously, "Do you want to learn? If you want to learn, I can teach you." Learning the sword was a difficult and dry matter. The two brothers in the grass hut became idiots in everyone's eyes. Everyone said that perhaps the manner of the master of the city had offended the temple for there to be two idiots. No one in the manor paid attention to these two idiots. Perhaps something terrifying had happened at the time, but he didn't know. He was only a child. Then on that night, everyone died. The person the child hated died. The person he loved died. The cat and dog he raised died. His brothers, sisters, uncles died. Even his parents, who loved him so dearly, died. Not a single person could survive. Only his entire body trembled as he stood behind the curtains of the mansion. He looked at the bloody sword in his idiotic big brother's hand and the pair of expressionless eyes. He began to feel afraid because he was sure that if he did not leave, this idiotic big brother would definitely kill him. That was perhaps the night Sigu Jian truly became a great grandmaster. It was also the night the youngest man in the manor began to flee for his life. From that night onwards, the shadow became a shadow. He could only live in the darkness forever and never saw a glimmer of sunlight again. His chest was filled with anger, hatred, resentment, and fear. He didn't dare sleep at night, because each time he did, he always seemed to see that pair of expressionless eyes. Thus, the shadow's face grew paler and paler. He knew that if he couldn't kill that person, he could only spend the rest of his life in darkness. That person had become a sword saint and a master of Dongi. Each time he heard this news, he felt that he could forever be that blood-covered, trembling, and silent child. Many years later, the sword that had accumulated 20 years of hatred, vengeance, and fear finally pierced into that person's body. This sword pierced through 20 years of time. Carrying incomparably complicated emotions, it finally tasted that person's blood. However, the shadow was not completely free. His entire body continued to tremble because he found that there was still so much blood on his body. Sigujin was still not dead. Sigujin's body was also covered in blood. However, it was unknown which was his and which was his brother's. The blood of brothers could often be exchanged, but it shouldn't be exchanged like this. The clothes on the two of them had been torn into countless pieces by the sword chi that crisscrossed the manor. They hung wretchedly on their bodies. Sigujin's eyelids drooped slightly, as if he would soon be unable to open them. His small body, like the shadow, began to tremble violently. Sigujin's 2 fingers held the tip of the sword. Like lightning, he pulled it out and sliced toward the shadow's neck. The shadow did not dodge. The fingers of his left hand formed a sword and pierced toward the bloody hole that had appeared after the tip of the sword had been pulled out. A life for a life. It would not end until one of them died. With a muffled slap, the 2 people's bodies separated abruptly. The shadow was like a rock, kicking up a trail of dust. He quickly followed the bloody path back and crashed heavily into the stone steps. Coughing up blood endlessly, he found it difficult to stop breathing. Sigujinji sat on the other side of the stone steps. There was half of the broken sword on his chest. The other half of the sword tip was held between his fingers. He looked coldly at the shadow on the other side of the stone steps. A trickle of blood slowly trickled down from his lips. The courtyard of the master of the city's manor sank into a terrifying silence. Fan Xian and the little emperor stood far away under a tree, watching the scene of brothers killing each other with pale faces. The little emperor didn't know who the black-clothed man was, but she could see that his strength was extremely powerful. Otherwise, he would not have been able to last so long with Sigujin. Fan Xian knew that in the end, it was the shadow who had lost. Although Sigujin had reached the end of his rope, a great grandmaster was still a great grandmaster. As long as he still had a breath, he could still proudly stand at the pinnacle of martial arts in the world. Although he was constantly being blown by the mountain wind and was in constant danger of falling into the mundane world, in the end he still stood firm. However, the shadow should feel proud. Fan Xian's eyes were slightly moist. He also felt proud for him. A 9th-level ace appeared powerful, but to be able to injure a great grandmaster into such a wretched state in a one-on-one duel was truly an exceptional performance. In the last moment, Sigujin had already used his great grandmaster realm and powerful willpower to control the situation. It was clear he could have killed the shadow. Why didn't he do so? Did he feel pity for his own brother? Fan Xian did not believe that this bloodthirsty and murderous great grandmaster would have such a warm feeling. After the scene was silent for a long time, Sigujin suddenly asked in a raspy voice, "If we count it seriously, you should be the first disciple of the Sword Hut." The shadow lay in a pool of blood and didn't reply. He only looked at him emotionlessly and unconsciously. Sigujin coughed endlessly and said, "To be able to use such a strike as you did today, you should be proud." A moment later, the shadow suddenly opened his mouth and said, "Why?" Why had Sigujin's temperament become deranged that year, killing in all directions, slaughtering his own clan, and not even sparing his own father and younger brother? This question had circled around the shadow's heart for many years. Under these circumstances, he finally asked it. Sigujien knew what he was asking, and so did Fan Xian. However, Sigujien did not answer the question. He only coldly said, "Those who stand in my way must die. You have followed us for a day and watched for a day. I had thought that you understood something by using that strike. Unexpectedly, you would still ask such a childish question. Little brother, you truly disappoint me." After these words were said, Fan Xian's heart jumped. Sigujien had long sensed that the shadow had been following him. Sigujien's teachings to him were not only targeted at him. He also hoped that the shadow, spying in the dark, would be able to sense something from it. The shadow was also silent. His ordinary eyes stared viciously at Sigujien at the foot of the stone steps in the distance, like a wild beast. He didn't say a word. He didn't need to debate what he should believe between the tragedy of the past and the words he said today. He only needed to confirm what he believed. Fan Xian followed the shadow's gaze and looked at the terrifying wound on Sigujien's chest. It was a blur of flesh and blood with a faint green light glowing on it like some kind of poison. Miraculously, it maintained the last signs of life in the organs that should have rotted to death. This was the punch the Qing Emperor had given Sigujien on Dong Mountain. Sigujien should have died a long time ago, but he had been able to drag out his life until now. There had to be something hidden, particularly the terrifying wound on his chest. Sigujien coldly used the last of his clothing to cover the wound on his abdomen. He glanced at the shadow, and then at Fan Xian. He said his last words, "A swordsman is a lethal weapon. Only saints can use it." Fan Xian was silent. He immediately understood the meaning of Sigujien's words. A swordsman was a lethal weapon. Only saints could use it. Saints were originally emotionless. Chapter 644. Yesterday, the situation suddenly changed. The brothers on the leaderboard were all extremely anxious, chasing each other. It was abnormally lively. The one in front was sprinting, the one behind was leaping, and I was stuck in the middle. I was also anxious, 110,000 points of fire burning in my heart. But there was no use in being anxious. I couldn't update fast enough, and I had to lower my head and admit it. Moreover, I really couldn't think of any reason to pull in the monthly votes. I couldn't possibly say that I was sleepy recently and needed everyone's monthly votes to wake me up, right? That was really too shameless. But I really needed everyone to cast their monthly votes. I needed your support. I liked the reward money, and I liked the vanity that came with being ranked. I'll say it very seriously and honestly. If you think that I've written well, please cast your monthly votes to me. Thank you very much. Monthly votes were lethal weapons. Only the strong could wield them. I held my long sword and looked around blankly. There was a bamboo hat at my feet. I softly said, "Give me some, give me some." You're tuning in to the Romance Rendezvous YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.